The sun always reached the terrace slopes of Ribeira 2 hours after the fishermen had already launched their skiffs into the gray Atlantic surf. But Ines was never awake to see the first light hit the water. She woke instead to the rhythmic, heavy thrum of old Mateo's walking stick striking the lower timber of her window frame. It was 3 sharp raps, followed by the dry, familiar wheeze of a man who had spent 40 years hauling salt nets before retiring to the quiet agricultural outskirt of the island. "The sun is burning the dew off the maize, lazy girl," Mateo called out, his voice muffled by the thick, louvered wooden shutters that kept the sea wind from rattling the glass at night. "Your mother left a kettle on the stove 3 hours ago. If the grain cart isn't greased before the heat rises, the timber axles will scream all the way to the docks." Ines groaned into the coarse linen of her pillow, pushing her face into the cool mattress ticking before rolling onto her back. The air inside the small basalt cottage smelled of dried rosemary from the rafters and the sharp, metallic tang of the coastal wind lingering in the floorboards. She didn't rush. Among the retired pensioners and weathered farmhands who inhabited Ribeira, she was universally treated with the doting indulgence reserved for the only young person who hadn't fled to the capital for harbor wages. By the time she pushed herself out of bed and pulled a rough wool shawl over her shoulders, Mateo had already left a warm loaf of millet bread wrapped in a damp corn husk on the outside windowsill. Ines broke a piece off with her teeth as she sat at the heavy timber kitchen table, pulling the town's ledger slate toward her. She spent 20 minutes with a sharpened stick of charcoal, verifying the tallies her mother had left on the scrap paper beside the salt jar. 12 sacks of dried coffee beans from the upper terrace, 4 crates of coarse sea salt, 80 bundles of sugar cane ready for the refinery mills in the lower city. She checked her calculation twice, running a callous thumb down the column of copper bits and silver weights until the numbers balanced against the quarterly tax assessment. She wasn't a scholar, but she knew the exact weight of a cheated grain sack, and no merchant in the lower docks had managed to short the village slate in 3 years. Once the ledger was tied securely inside an oiled leather satchel, Ines stood before the small, cracked looking-glass hanging beside the larder door. She didn't look at her face, she looked at her hair. With practiced mechanical speed, she gathered the dark, heavy mass at the nape of her neck, twisting it tight until she could bind it flat against her skull with strips of coarse linen twine. She stripped off her wool shawl and skirt, pulling on the loose, sun-faded canvas trousers and the oversized, grease-stained tunic her mother kept folded in the bottom timber chest. She dropped a wide-brimmed fisherman's cap low over her forehead, tucking the stray ends of twine beneath the brim until the girl who balanced the village books disappeared entirely. When she stepped out of the cottage into the blinding coastal light, she was Enzo. The 3-mile journey across the river barrier toward the sprawling port of Lower Pico Alto was measured entirely by the shifting smell of the air and the drag of the cart wheels. Ines walked alongside the draft mule, her hand resting lightly on the iron-shod timber shaft to feel the vibration of the road. As they left the terraced greenery of Ribeira, the sweet scent of flowering sugarcane and damp earth was swallowed by the sulphurous, heavy smog of the lower smithies. Here, the road shifted from packed dirt to dark volcanic basalt cobblestones. The early industrial wealth of the merchant guilds was baked into the street itself. Embedded strips of low-grade resonant stone ran along the center of the thoroughfare, emitting a dull, vibrating hum that pulsed through the soles of her leather boots. At night, those strips would glow with a sickly yellow luminescence to guide the automated cargo carts, but in the harsh midday sun, they just looked like cracked, dusty glass pressed into the mud. She stopped at the outer toll gate, pulling the draft mule to a halt before a timber barrier reinforced with iron banding. The gatekeeper, a man whose tunic was stained dark with soot from the nearby refinery furnaces, didn't even look up from his breakfast of fried saltfish. 18 crates, agricultural, Ines said, pitching her voice down into the flat, clipped drawl of the harbor boys. She reached into her leather satchel, fishing out 2 worn copper bits and dropping them onto the wooden toll counter. The coins spun on the greasy timber before lying flat. Price went up by half a bit on cane sugar this morning, the gatekeeper grunted, pushing one of the coins back with a dirty thumbnail while holding out his palm for another. House Monteiro levied a new transit tariff on anything combustible, say the refinery furnaces are running too hot and they need more water guards on the canal. Ines didn't argue. She simply pulled a third copper bit from her pouch, pressing it flat into his palm with enough force that he finally looked up, his bloodshot eyes registering her face for a fraction of a second before he pulled the release lever. The iron counterweight clanked heavily, lifting the timber boom just high enough for the mule to pass beneath. "Tell your people to sell the salt before midday," the gatekeeper added as she grabbed the mule's bridle. "The cargo ferries from the Leeward Islands are docking this afternoon. Once that brine hits the market, your dry salt won't be worth the sackcloth it's sewn in." "Appreciate it," Ines muttered, tugging the mule forward into the noise of the lower city. The lower Pico Alto market was a labyrinth of wet basalt, shouting dockhands, and the relentless, mechanical thumping of the paddle-wheel cargo ferries churning the harbor water behind the warehouses. Once the grain and sugar crates were unloaded at the guild scales, and the silver weights were safely locked inside her satchel, Ines left the mule tethered in the shade of a dried fish stall and slipped down an alleyway that smelled strongly of brine and rotting cabbage. She found her usual bench behind the sailmender's yard, where 3 boys from the lower smithies were already sitting on an overturned timber crate, passing around a grease-spotted paper cone of fried dough balls. "Look who survived the mud," Myro said, tossing a dough ball through the air. Ines caught it one-handed, the boiling oil stinging her palm as she bit into the sweet, dense bread. "Thought the terrace slide might have buried your village yesterday in Zo. We heard the old mountain took a shift." "It was just a drainage ditch overflowing," Ines said, chewing slowly as she leaned her shoulders back against the sun-warmed basalt wall of the yard. "Nothing fell that old Mateo couldn't dig out with a garden spade before breakfast." "You shouldn't stay out there," Nico muttered. He was younger than the others, his forearms permanently stained with gray soot from working the bellows in the Racha Guild foundries. He pointed a dirty finger toward the towering, sheer basalt cliffs that rose 3,000 feet above the harbor, the upper capital, where the gleaming white marble estates of the high houses hung suspended over the ocean drops like birds of prey. "My uncle says House Monteiro is doubling their private guard contracts. They're buying up all the refined resonant stones from the lower pits. If the high houses start trading blows again, those outskirt terraces will be the first thing burnt to clear sightlines for the sky beasts." Ines snorted, brushing a crumb of fried dough from her canvas tunic. She looked past the shipyard masts toward the outer breakwater, where a heavy, 2-legged wyvern was currently being dragged onto a floating wooden landing stage by 4 handlers wielding iron pikes. The beast was roughly the size of a hay wagon, its leathery, sea-green wings dragging uselessly in the salt water as it let out a wet, grating squawk that sounded like a rusted iron gate swinging in a gale. A courier crate strapped to its shoulders was dripping with sea slime. "Look at that thing," Ines said, gesturing toward the squawking beast with her chin. "It smells like dead mackerel, and it can barely lift 30 pounds of mail across the channel without needing a 3-day nap on a wet dock. You really think those aristocratic bastards up on the cliffs have anything up there that can melt an army? It's all high society talk, Nico. They tell you they command mythical fire gods so you don't complain when they take 6 silver weights out of your foundry pay for harbor defense." "True dragons aren't wyverns in Zo," Nico said, his voice dropping instinctively, his eyes darting toward the alley entrance as if a city guard might materialize from the shadows. "The ones House Monteiro keeps in the upper caldera don't eat fish. They don't fly mail. When the old Patriarch rode his beast over the southern revolt 40 years ago, my uncle said the sky turned the color of a bruised plum and the canal water boiled inside the stone banks." "Your uncle drinks too much fermented cane juice," Ines said, though she felt a faint, rhythmic vibration through the basalt wall behind her, not from the sky, but from the deep, subterranean mana pumps that fed the city's water lines. She stood up, wiping the grease from her hands onto her trousers. "I have to get the mule before the harbor master cites me for blocking the fish carts. Keep your heads down." By the time Ines pushed the empty timber cart back up the winding dirt road toward Ribera, the sun had dropped below the western ridge, painting the sky in long, bruised streaks of indigo and dull orange. The temperature fell rapidly, the coastal humidity turning sharp and cold the moment she crossed the river barrier away from the city's heated stone thoroughfares. She stopped at the village well, unfastening the leather satchel and hiding it securely beneath the seat plank of the cart before dipping a wooden bucket into the dark water. She splashed her face twice, scrubbing the city dust from her cheeks and jaw until her skin stung from the cold. With a quick jerk of her fingers, she snapped the linen twine binding her hair, shaking her head until the heavy dark strands fell over her shoulders, damp and smelling of well water. Enzo evaporated into the twilight air. She was Ines again when she pushed the cottage door open. The single room was already warm. Her mother, Solange, was sitting on a low timber stool beside the fireplace, the firelight casting deep, sharp shadows across the exhausted lines of her face. She was scraping dried mud off the blade of an iron-field spade with a dull kitchen knife, the metal scraping against metal with a slow, rhythmic rasp that filled the quiet space. Ines didn't speak immediately. She hung her wool coat on the wall peg and moved to the small table, lifting the cast-iron kettle from the fire stones and pouring boiling water into 2 clay cups filled with crushed chicory root. She set 1 cup on the floorboards beside her mother's stool before sitting at the table, wrapping her cold hands around the rough clay of her own mug. "The salt sold for a good price," Ines said quietly, watching the dark chicory ground settle at the bottom of her cup. "We cleared 11 silver weights after the gate tariff. Old Mateo's share is enough to buy him the heavy wool blankets from the merchant caravan before the frost hits." Solange didn't look up from the spade. The dull knife scraped along the iron edge, peeling away a thick curl of gray clay. "Did the gatekeeper ask questions?" "Just complaints about the refinery tariffs," Ines said. She hesitated, tracing a crack in the clay cup with her thumbnail. The domestic safety of the room felt heavy, almost suffocating after the wide, windy expanse of the harbor road. "Mother, the caravan road opens to the Leeward Islands next month. The Racha Guild is offering seasonal contracts for clerks who know how to balance agricultural slates. I'm 18 next week. If I take a 3-month contract on the ferries, I could bring back enough coin to replace the cottage roof before the spring rains." The knife stopped moving. Solange didn't turn her head, but Ines saw her knuckles turn dead white where her hand gripped the timber handle of the field spade. The silence in the room stretched, heavy and taut, broken only by the hiss of a wet log spitting sap in the hearth fire. "You aren't going back to the docks," Solange said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a flat, absolute rigidity that Ines had rarely heard. She set the kitchen knife down on the hearth stone with a sharp, final clink. "I spoke to Mateo this afternoon. His grandson, the one with the limp, is taking over the city run. He will drive the mule. He will pay the gate tariffs." Ines stared at her mother's back, a sudden, hot flash of indignation rising in her chest, tight enough to make her breath hitch. "He can't balance a slate. He'll let the harbor guilds short the village by 1/3 on the first run. I've done the route for 4 years without losing a copper bit. Why would you?" "Because you are too old to look like a boy in an oversized tunic," Solange snapped, turning so fast her stool scraped loudly against the floorboards. She reached out, grabbing a damp linen rag from the hearth and wringing it between her hands with a violence that made the fabric tear. Her eyes were wide, the pupils dilated in the dim firelight, fixed on Ines with an intensity that looked terrifyingly like panic. "You think because you lower your voice and chew fried dough with the foundry boys that you are invisible. You aren't invisible, Ines. You are 18 years old and you have your father's eyes. Every time you cross that river gate, I sit here wondering if today is the day a high-house surveyor looks down from a carriage window and recognizes the face of a dead man." Ines stood up, her clay cup rattling against the timber table as her knee caught the edge. "My father was a merchant sailor who died in the Southern Revolt. You've told me that since I was old enough to speak." "I lied to keep you breathing," Solange screamed. She dropped the torn linen rag, stepping toward the table, her breathing ragged and shallow, her chest heaving as she anchored both hands onto the edge of the timber board, leaning her weight forward. Your father never sailed a commercial boat in his life. He wore polished white steel and lived in a fortress 3,000 feet above the harbor. He was the younger brother of Patriarch Monteiro. The air in the cottage seemed to stop moving. Ines looked at her mother's hands, the calloused, earth-stained fingers gripping the wood so hard the timber groaned. Her brain refused to process the words, attempting to force them into the familiar shape of village gossip or harbor exaggeration. "That's crazy," Ines whispered, her voice cracking. She stepped backward, her thighs striking the edge of the larder door. "House Monteiro, they don't have stray children. They are dynastic lords. They burn cities. And they clean their bloodlines," Solange said, her voice dropping into a hoarse, trembling whisper that was worse than the screaming. She reached out a hand, her fingers trembling as she tried to touch Ines's wrist, but Ines flinched back against the wall. "When your father was killed in the caldera disputes, his brother ordered the private quarters cleared of any unofficial attachments. I ran through the drainage canals with you wrapped in my apron, while the city guards were still washing his blood off the marble courtyards. If anyone from that house ever discovers what you are, if they ever see a bastard child with Monteiro features walking the harbor road, they won't just turn you away, Ines. They will kill you to keep the succession slate clean." The sheer, suffocating weight of the room pressed down on Ines's chest until her lungs felt incapable of drawing air. She looked at her mother's face, not seeing the familiar, comforting farmhand who made chicory tea, but a woman who had lived for 18 years under the crushing, permanent terror of an execution order. Every rule, every boy's cap, every restriction had been a desperate, frantic wall built out of mud and fear to hide her from the sky. And Ines was the curse that had built it. When Solange took another step forward, her hand reaching out again, Ines couldn't breathe. The guilt of being a walking, breathing death sentence for the woman who had sacrificed everything to hide her broke something in her chest. She didn't speak. She grabbed her heavy wool coat from the wall peg, wrenched the timber latch of the door open, and stumbled out into the freezing blackness of the road. She didn't run toward the agricultural terraces. Driven by a blind, animal instinct to reach the only place where she felt like a normal human being, she ran down the dirt thoroughfare toward the river barrier, heading back toward the lower city docks. By midnight, the adrenaline had completely burned out of her muscles, leaving her shivering and hollow beneath the dripping eaves of a closed cooper's shop in the lower smithies. The heavy sulphurous fog of the harbor hung thick in the alleyway, carrying the damp chill of the ocean off the water. Ines sat on an overturned wooden barrel, her knees pulled up to her chest, her fingers dug deep into the coarse wool of her coat sleeves. The city was quiet around her, anchored by the mundane, comforting sounds of maritime labor. The distant clinking of a night watchman's bell 3 streets over, the rhythmic creaking of the ship masts in the harbor, and the low, vibrating hum of the ground-lit basalt stones, fading to a dull amber as the mana pumps lowered their overnight pressure. She felt profoundly, bitterly foolish. The anger that had driven her out of the cottage had curdled into a sickening shame. Her mother had spent 18 years destroying her own hands in the freezing agricultural soil just to keep them hidden, and Ines had screamed at her over a seasonal ferry contract. She leaned her forehead against her knees, making a quiet, rational decision. She would sit here until the first harbor light touched the water, then she would walk the 3 miles back to Ribeira. She would apologize to Solange. She would let Mateo's lame grandson drive the mule. She would stay in the terrace slopes forever, invisible and quiet, if that was the price of keeping her mother alive. She pushed herself up from the wooden barrel, her boots scraping against the damp basalt cobblestones as she turned to face the street. That was when the sky shattered. It wasn't thunder. Thunder rolled across the water from the open ocean, building slowly before it struck the hills. This sound originated from directly above her, a massive, descending acoustic shockwave that struck the harbor city like a physical blow from an iron hammer. It was a roar, but it bore no resemblance to the wet, grating squawk of the mail courier wyverns at the docks. This was an ancient, resonant vibration of absolute apex dominance that rattled the teeth in her jaw and vibrated through the marrow of her bones. Above her, 3,000 feet up in the shrouded darkness of the volcanic peaks, the primary dragon of House Monteiro was screaming in mourning. The sound carried the terrifying acoustic weight of an earthquake, tearing through the cloud cover with enough kinetic force that the glass window panes in the cooper's shop behind her shattered inward, showering the damp cobblestones with sharp, glittering shards. Ines stumbled backward, her boots slipping on the wet glass, her hands slapping against the timber doorframe to keep her from falling. Before she could draw breath to scream, the darkness of the alleyway was torn apart by the blinding, brilliant blue glare of military-grade resonance slates. They didn't come from the road. They dropped from the upper fire escapes. Armored boots hit the wet basalt with heavy, synchronized precision. Enforcers, 6 of them, wearing polished black steel plates over midnight velvet tunics that gleamed under the unnatural blue light, surrounded her in a tight, flawless tactical ring. These weren't the bored, soot-stained harbor guards who took copper bits at the toll gates. These were High House elite, their weapons drawn, their movements silent and fluid as they closed the distance. "Target confirmed," a voice said from behind a polished steel visor. It wasn't a question. It was a mechanical reading from a glowing resonance lens mounted to the man's gauntlet. Facial geometry matches the deceased brother's lineage records. Secure the stray. Ines fought with the desperate, scrappy ferocity of the harbor alleys. As 2 guards lunged forward to seize her arms, she drove her heel hard into the leading man's knee plate, twisting her shoulder to wrench her wrist out of his steel-gauntleted grip. She spun, kicking an overturned timber crate into the path of the second enforcer, and scrambling toward the open thoroughfare of the sailmender's yard, screaming at the top of her lungs. "Myro, Nico, help, guards!" She stumbled into the open yard, the blue light of the resonance slates illuminating the space like high noon. 2 of the foundry boys were still there, huddled under the canvas overhang where they had been sleeping between shifts. At the sound of her scream, Nico jerked upright, his eyes wide with sleep and shock as he looked directly at her. "Nico?" Ines gasped, reaching a hand toward him as the armored boots thundered behind her. Nico looked at her outstretched hand. Then his eyes shifted past her shoulder, locking onto the polished black steel and the silver crest of House Monteiro engraved on the enforcer's chest plates. The color drained from the boy's face instantly, leaving him dead white beneath the foundry soot. He didn't speak. He didn't reach for a tool or shout for the watch. With a chilling, absolute survival instinct that froze Ines's blood, Nico dropped his gaze to the mud at his feet. He reached out, grabbing Myro by the collar and dragging the older boy backward into the shadows of the canvas overhang, turning their backs completely to the yard. They didn't even tremble. They simply ceased to see her. The unspoken rule of the kingdom played out in cold, silent reality. When the high houses reach down from the sky, the common earth does not look up. A steel gauntlet closed around Ines's upper arm with the immovable force of an iron vice, pulling her backward off her feet. A thick piece of velvet cloth was pressed firmly over her mouth, muffling her final, ragged scream as her arms were bound fast behind her back with cold leather straps. She was hoisted bodily off the cobblestones and dragged out of the alleyway toward the main harbor road, where a heavy, 6-wheeled carriage plated in reinforced steel and polished obsidian sat waiting, its window shutters bolted tight from the outside. The door was wrenched open, and Ines was thrown onto the plush interior seats. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind her, the locking bars dropping into place with a deep, reverberating thud that severed the sound of the ocean completely. The ride up the 3,000-foot mountain road was measured in oppressive, suffocating silence. Inside the high house carriage, the air smelled of imported lavender and cold, oiled steel. 2 enforcers sat opposite her, their visors lowered, their hands resting on the pommels of their broadswords, completely ignoring the way she kicked her boots against the floorboards until her ankles bled against the leather restraints. She wasn't looking at them. Her eyes were fixed on the velvet curtain covering the bolted window, her brain spinning in a vortex of pure, sickening dread that had nothing to do with where they were taking her. "Did they track me from the gate?" she thought, her teeth biting into her lip until she tasted copper. "Did they go to the village first? If they found the cottage, if Mom tried to stop them with a kitchen knife. The rhythmic, heavy clatter of the iron-shod hooves shifted abruptly. The uneven, grinding vibration of the basalt harbor road smoothed out into the flawless, silent glide of polished white marble. The air leaking through the floorboard seals grew thin, sharp, and freezing cold, the altitude of the peaks. The carriage groaned to a halt. The external locking bars withdrew with a metallic scrape, and the door was pulled open, letting in a blinding shaft of morning light that stung her dark-adjusted eyes. She was dragged out of the carriage by her upper arms, her boots slipping on smooth, polished stone as she was hauled through a towering archway carved from solid black volcanic glass. She expected a damp dungeon or a blood-stained execution courtyard. Instead, she was dropped onto a floor of heated, cream-colored marble inside a chamber, so vast the ceiling was lost in shadows. The air was thick with the suffocating, cloying scent of burning jasmine incense. Servants in silent silk shoes moved instantly around her, their faces pale and blank as they stripped the mud-caked canvas tunic from her shoulders with practiced, trembling efficiency. A basin of steaming water scented with bitter almond was brought forward. Hands that felt like ice scrubbed the harbor soot from her cheeks and wrists, refusing to make eye contact with her even as she thrashed against their grip. Ines was pushed into a high-backed chair before a massive arch of polished silver glass. She looked up, her chest heaving, and saw herself for the first time without the fisherman's cap or the binding twine. Her dark hair fell around her shoulders in a wild, tangled mass, framing a sharp, pale jaw and eyes that were too bright, too cold, and too undeniably aristocratic for an agricultural terrace. She was alive, but as she listened to the distant, rhythmic vibration of the ancient dragon pacing the upper towers above the ceiling, she realized with crushing certainty that the stray daughter had been dragged out of the mud and placed directly onto the board. And someone in this fortress was about to make a move. Welcome to the Portal Library. Step through and let the magic begin. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment if you'd love more stories or have a request. We have a Patreon where you can support the story production directly or to follow for free and stay up to date with new story drafts notifications. The link will be included in the description below. New videos are uploaded on YouTube every Monday. Dragonfall, an epic fantasy story. Chapter 1. The Gilded Trap in the Smiling Air. The morning silks felt less like a dress and more like a finely woven coffin. The fabric was impossibly heavy, dyed a stifling, light-absorbing black that clung to Ines's ribs and made every breath feel shallow. A suffocating collar of stiff lace pressed against her throat, hiding the pulse that had been hammering relentlessly against her skin for the last 3 hours. She was alone in the sprawling, gilded bedchamber. The silent, terrified servants who had scrubbed her clean had departed, leaving the heavy mahogany doors closed behind them. Ines didn't sit on the edge of the lavish, feather-stuffed mattress. She hadn't stopped moving since the latch clicked shut. I have to get out. I have to find a slate. I have to know if she's alive. Her mother's panicked voice played on an endless, looping echo in her mind. They will kill you to keep the succession slate clean. Ines paced the length of the heated marble floor, her bare feet silent. She tracked the heavy, metallic clinking of the enforcer's armor in the corridor outside. 2 guards. They paced 30 steps to the left, paused for 4 seconds, and paced 30 steps back. She needed a secondary exit. She pressed her palms against the smooth basalt blocks of the far wall, dragging her fingertips along the seams until she found a narrow, unassuming wooden door hidden behind a velvet tapestry. She heard some servants heading out that way earlier. She lifted the heavy skirts of her morning dress, easing the iron latch open. The corridor beyond was narrow, smelling strongly of beeswax and lamp oil. She slipped inside, her heart leaping with a sudden, desperate spike of hope, until she rounded the first corner and nearly collided with a young maid carrying a stack of folded linens. Ines moved instinctively, grabbing the girl's wrist. "Please," Ines whispered, dropping her voice into the rough, rapid cadence of the harbor docks. "Who holds the communication slates? Just point me to the messenger's quarters. I have a silver weight sewn into my coat. I can give it." The maid didn't scream. Worse, her eyes went perfectly wide and blank, dropping instantly to the floorboards. She pulled her wrist out of Ines's grip with a violent flinch, backing away as if Ines were made of burning pitch. "I cannot see you, my lady," the maid whispered to the floor, her voice trembling so hard the linens shook. "I am blind to you, please." The maid turned and fled down the narrow hall, leaving Ines standing in the dim light. The realization began to creep into the edges of Ines's mind, cold and damp. It wasn't just the enforcers keeping her here. The entire fortress was a living mechanism of terror. Nobody was going to help her. She kept moving, following the draft of cold, salt-heavy air filtering through the servants' passage until it opened into a wide, deserted gallery. At the end of the hall, a set of glass double doors stood slightly ajar, leading out onto a grand, sweeping terrace. Ines rushed toward the light, pushing the glass doors wide. The freezing, violent wind of the upper peak slammed into her, whipping her dark hair across her face. She rushed to the waist-high marble balustrade, leaning over the edge to look for the mountain road, calculating if she could climb down the stonework. She looked down, and her breath simply stopped. There was no road. There was only a sheer, terrifying 3,000-foot drop of smooth, black volcanic glass. The lower city docks were nothing but tiny, insignificant gray smudges at the bottom of the world. Even worse, the airspace between the terrace and the ocean was actively patrolled. 4 massive, leather-winged wyverns circled the lower drafts, their armored riders holding long, steel-tipped lances. The final, crushing realization snapped into place. She couldn't fight her way out. She couldn't climb down. She was a rat caught in a steel drum miles above the earth. "The wind is quite brutal on this side of the caldera, isn't it?" Ines spun around, her shoulders hitting the marble balustrade. A young man was standing in the doorway of the terrace. He wore immaculate, tailored mourning clothes, a dark velvet coat over a crisp charcoal tunic, a silver crest pinned over his heart. He was strikingly handsome, with warm, golden-brown eyes and a relaxed, effortless posture that made the sprawling, terrifying fortress look like his personal living room. He smiled at her. It was a gentle, brilliant smile. "I am Tiago," he said, taking a slow step onto the terrace. "The air is too thin out here for those silks, Ines. You're shivering." If she hadn't heard her mother's warning, that warm tone would have broken her. She would have collapsed into tears and begged him for help. But standing on the edge of the abyss, Ines looked at his perfectly relaxed hands and felt the hair on her arms stand up. "My mother," Ines demanded, her voice tight, refusing to move from the railing. "The guards who dragged me here, did they go to the village? Is she alive?" Tiago stopped a few feet away, clasping his hands behind his back. His warm smile didn't waver, nor did it reach his eyes. The seamstresses really performed a miracle with the tailoring, considering the short notice. "Black suits your complexion." Ines stared at him, her chest heaving. "I asked you a question. Did your guards kill my mother?" "We are expected in the grand hall," Tiago continued smoothly, extending a perfectly manicured hand toward her. He spoke as if she hadn't said a word, completely and utterly ignoring her panic. "The royal observer from the capital has already arrived. It would be deeply embarrassing for the family if you were late." He wasn't threatening her. He wasn't mocking her. He was simply dismissing her humanity entirely. To Tiago, her mother's life was so aggressively irrelevant it didn't even warrant a lie. "I'm not going anywhere until you let me use a slate," Ines said, gripping the marble rail until her knuckles ached. Tiago let his outstretched hand fall. He tilted his head slightly, his smile softening into something resembling pity. "Ines, today, the counselors of the high courts will decide who controls the legal ledgers. The provincial lords will decide who controls the agricultural territories. And the royal crown will decide who it recognizes as legitimate. We are all pieces on a very delicate board today. You are a piece that arrived unannounced." He stepped forward, gently but firmly taking her elbow. His grip felt like an iron manacle wrapped in velvet. "Pieces do not make demands. They move where they are placed. Come." He guided her off the freezing terrace and into the labyrinth of the fortress. As they walked, the silence of the corridors was broken by a deep, rhythmic thudding from the upper towers, the Patriarch's mourning dragon, pacing its volcanic enclosure. Every time the massive beast took a step, the crystal chandeliers above them trembled. Ines stopped fighting Tiago's grip. She walked mechanically, locking her jaw, realizing that showing fear to this man was like bleeding into shark-infested water. Tiago pushed open a set of towering obsidian doors, leading her into the grand caldera hall. The sheer scale of the room was dizzying. Heated marble floors stretched toward a raised dais at the far end. The air was thick with the smell of burning jasmine incense and the low, tense murmurs of 100 aristocratic elites. Tiago led her toward the front of the crowd, stopping near two other figures standing at the base of the dais. One was a woman with sharp, severe features and hair pulled back in tight, intricate braids. This was Beatrice. She wasn't weeping. She was quietly speaking to a huddle of elderly, robed men, the diplomatic counselors of the high courts, her eyes darting around the room, tracking every merchant lord and guild master, calculating their worth. Standing a few feet away from her was a mountain of a man in heavy, dark steel armor, Valdir. He radiated a barely contained, explosive violence. He wasn't speaking to anyone. He was glaring directly across the room at an older man wearing the crimson sash of the royal family, Minister Silva, the crown's observer. None of the three siblings looked at Ines. They looked through her, calculating how her sudden existence threatened their claim to the four pillars of power. An elderly uncle, wearing the heavy silver chains of the Patriarch's executor, stepped up to the dais. He held a glowing resonant slate in his hands. The low murmurs in the hall instantly died, replaced by a suffocating, absolute silence. "The final words of the Patriarch," the elder announced, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He looked down at the slate. He didn't read a long, poetic speech. The Patriarch had been a man of terrifying efficiency. "I leave no name," the elder read, his voice tight with shock. A collective, sharp intake of breath swept through the hall. Beatrice's head snapped toward the dais, her eyes narrowing. Valdir's jaw clenched. "The House of Monteiro is not a gift to be handed down," the elder continued, reading the glowing words. "It is an iron canopy. He who holds the military might of the beasts, the diplomatic seals of the high courts, the agricultural lifeblood of the territories, and the recognition of the crown holds the house. Claim them or be crushed by them." The elder lowered the slate. The succession was entirely open. There were no rules. It was a blank mandate for war. Beatrice immediately turned back to the high counselors, her voice dropping into a rapid, urgent whisper, already moving to secure the diplomatic pillar before the echo of the words faded. Tiago turned smoothly toward the provincial lords gathered near the windows, his warm smile firmly in place as he moved to lock down the territorial votes. But Valdir didn't move toward the politicians. He turned his back on the dais, his heavy steel boots ringing against the marble as he marched directly toward the massive archways leading to the open, volcanic courtyard. Ines watched him go, a sickening knot forming in her stomach. The rhythmic thudding from the upper towers had stopped. The air pressure in the room suddenly dropped, making her ears pop. A shadow the size of a merchant ship blotted out the sun shining through the courtyard arches. The glass windows of the grand hall shattered inward as the Patriarch's dragon landed on the polished marble outside. The beast was a nightmare of charcoal scales and simmering, internal heat, its massive claws tearing deep gouges into the stone. It let out a low, rumbling hiss that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the bones in Ines's chest. Valdir walked straight out into the courtyard, the harsh light gleaming off his armor. He didn't flinch as the beast lowered its massive, horned head toward him. He reached out and placed his steel gauntlet directly onto the dragon's snout. The beast didn't snap its jaws. It leaned into his touch, submitting to the rider. Inside the hall, Beatrice stopped talking. Tiago's smile finally vanished. Valdir looked back through the shattered archway, his eyes sweeping over his siblings, the counselors, the royal observer, and finally lingering on Ines. He didn't have the ledgers. He didn't have the votes. But as the dragon let out a terrifying, smoke-filled roar behind him, the message was absolute. The military pillar was his, and the game had officially begun. Chapter 2: The Invisible Hand. The winter gale did not just howl against the stone of the upper fortress. It was a cacophony of deafening whirlwind sounds. In the 3 weeks since Valdir had bonded the Patriarch's dragon, the Racha Guild's embargo had tightened until the upper capital felt less like a seat of power and more like a tomb cut from living rock. The monostone strips embedded in the floors had dimmed to a pathetic, flickering amber, casting long, shivering shadows across the marble hallways. Rationed coal fires burned in the central hearths, but the heat died within 10 feet, leaving the rest of the vast, hollowed-out caldera biting and damp. Down in the deep pits, the dragon had stopped its rhythmic pacing. Now, it only let out low, stomach-churning rumbles of hunger that shook the dust from the tapestries, a constant, acoustic reminder to the entire house that the apex predator was starving. Beatriz Monteiro stared at a stack of parchment ledgers in her study, her fingers numb inside her silk-lined gloves. Valdir scorched the Valari sugarcane fields, her scout reported, his voice tight with fatigue. The merchants won't budge. They've locked the transit gates. We have no incoming grain nor fuel for the moment. Beatriz did not look up. She was calculating the burn rate of the house's remaining emergency supplies. They had 8 days of food left. After that, the dragon would be the only thing eating. "And Tiago?" she asked. "He's in the lower city, my lady, promising 3 meals a day to any slum-born boy who signs an enlistment paper. He's building a militia out of the common people. The Racha Guild is panicking, but they still refuse to open the gates." Beatriz closed the ledger. The political laws she had spent a lifetime mastering were useless against an empty belly. The house was eating itself alive. 3 floors below the study, Ines was fighting her own war in the dark. She was locked in her gilded bedchamber, staring at the heavy brass grate of the ventilation shaft near the floorboards. Her knuckles were raw and bleeding. For 3 weeks, she had been a ghost, isolated with nothing but her own spiraling panic about her mother's safety in Ribeira. But Ines was an agricultural ledger keeper. She understood systems. She had spent the last week tracking the only variable in her room, the terrified maid who brought her meager rations. Ines noted the grease stains on the girl's apron, the smell of stolen cured meat, and the exact timing of the shifts. She took a guess that the servants might be using the labyrinth of old laundry chutes to smuggle black market scraps past the high house guards based on the sounds she heard on her various escape attempts. Yesterday, Ines had cornered the maid, threatening to scream for the enforcers and expose the entire smuggling ring unless the girl dropped a coded message down the chute to the lower city docks. Just a simple request to old Mateo to confirm her mother was alive. Now the heavy deadbolts on her bedroom door clanked open. The maid slipped inside, setting a silver tray with a single piece of hardtack bread and a cup of water on the table. The girl didn't speak. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, her hands trembling violently, before turning and fleeing the room. Ines moved to the table. Beneath the bread was a small, black leather ledger. It bore the heavy wax seal of the royal crown. Ines felt the blood drain from her face. She picked up the ledger, flipping it open. It was filled with heavily classified diplomatic intercepts, detailing the exact bribes and extortions Beatriz Monteiro was using to hold the High Court judges hostage. It was the absolute ruin of Beatriz's political pillar. Her smuggled message was intercepted. They had bypassed the servant network, slipped this onto her tray, and left no note. Ines could make an educated guess. Someone wanted her to expose and shake Beatriz's stronghold. Leaking this info to the merchants would help tilt the stalemate. But would that be the best path of survival for her and her mother? Ines squeezed the leather binding until the joints in her hands ached. If she leaked it, Beatriz fell, but Valdir or Tiago would inevitably find out Ines was the rat and kill her. If she did nothing, who knows what could happen? She didn't hesitate. She shoved the ledger into the pocket of her soot-stained canvas tunic, marched to the heavy oak doors, and hammered her bleeding fists against the wood. "Take me to my sister," Ines shouted through the timber at the enforcers outside. Take me to Beatrice right now." 10 minutes later, Ines stood in the freezing war room. The armored guards retreated, leaving the heavy obsidian doors to groan shut. "I have already told the guard captain that I have no interest in whatever pathetic plea you've concocted," Beatrice said, her voice devoid of heat. It was a flat, utilitarian dismissal. She didn't look at Ines, she looked at the disaster reports on her desk. "You are an uneducated variable. You have no military backing, no diplomatic rank, and you are a liability to my legitimacy. Leave." Ines pulled her hand from her pocket. She slid the black leather ledger gently across the polished grain of the desk. "Somebody gave me this," Ines said, her voice raspy but steady. Beatrice finally looked up, her expression freezing into a mask of pure, razor-thin suspicion. She recognized the royal seal instantly. "And why would the crown hand a bastard the keys to my ruin?" "Because he thinks I'm a rat," Ines said, berating internally from failing to recognize such an obvious sign, holding Beatrice's cold gaze. "He's playing both of us. He wants you to lose your court support so he can step in and stabilize the house under royal decree. He expects me to leak this to the merchants and burn your pillar of power." Ines was internally surprised on how fast she came up with that. Beatrice's eyes flicked down to the ledger, then back to Ines. Her suspicion didn't soften, it sharpened. She stood, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. "You are playing a dangerous game, dearest little sister. If you are lying, I won't bother with a trial. I will hand you to Valdir's dragon myself." "I don't want the house," Ines said, refusing to blink. "I don't want your counselors or your territory. I want a squad of royal-grade enforcers stationed at the terrace gates of my village in Ribeira. I want my mother protected, and I want the blockade broken." "And how, exactly, does a girl who spent her life ignoring of high society plan to break an embargo set by the Racha Guild?" Beatrice asked, her tone dripping with ice. Ines leaned forward, bracing her hands on the desk. "Because while you were reading diplomatic treaties, I was the one who actually engaged with the common people. I know which guild masters are selling their own supplies on the black market to pay off their gambling debts. You can't break the embargo with laws only, Beatrice. You break it by making it more profitable for them to feed us than to starve us. I have hands-on experience dealing with local merchants. You have the power to influence the law. We would be unstoppable. Do we have a deal?" Beatrice stared at her for a long, silent moment. "Get your coat," Beatrice commanded. "We are going to the lower docks. If you want the authority to move my gold, I will show you exactly what your brother's war looks like in person." The descent down the mountain was a masterclass in ruin. Beatrice led Ines to the heavy, iron-grated supply funicular that clung to the sheer basalt cliffs, dropping them straight down into the freezing, coastal rain. Through the driving storm, Ines saw the mid-level terraces where the loyalist minor houses used to thrive. House Verla's ancestral estate was entirely gone. The iron gates had melted into twisted slag, and the heavy stone manors had been reduced to a sprawling, blackened crater of ash. The funicular slammed into the lower docking station with a bone-jarring clank. Ines stepped out onto the slick cobblestones of the harbor, the freezing rain soaking through her thin tunic in seconds. The bustling, loud violence of the merchant docks had been replaced by a hollow, predatory silence. The wharf sides were choked with gaunt, hollow-eyed commoners. In the central plaza, Ines saw a long, shivering line of boys standing in the mud, waiting to press their thumbs onto Tiago's provincial militia contracts in exchange for a half-loaf of stale bread. Ines stopped walking. Her boots felt glued to the wet basalt. Standing near the front of the enlistment line was Nico. He was swimming in an oversized, waterlogged leather breastplate, holding a rusted spear with blue fingers. He looked up, his hollowed eyes sweeping over the Royal Guard escort and landing on Ines. There was no recognition. The starvation had scraped the humanity out of him, leaving only the terrifying, blank indifference of an animal trying to survive. He dropped his gaze to the mud, stepping forward to take his bread. "This is the cost of your brother's pride," Beatrice said, stepping up beside Ines, her heavy wool coat dripping onto the stones. "Do you see it now? The people have given up. The guilds are starving us, and Tiago is using your people as fuel." Ines watched Nico bite into the bread. A hot, sharp pressure built in her chest, tight enough to crack her ribs. "The Racha Guild is moving their private stores through the eastern sea caves," Beatrice said, her voice dropping into a flat, mechanical rhythm. She turned her back on the plaza, looking up at the fog-shrouded peaks of the upper capital. "They bypass their own toll guards by bribing the night watch. I can give you the authority to clear the lower canal gates. You have to figure out a way to intercept the smuggling skiffs. Take a third of their cargo as a shadow tariff and let them keep the rest. That way they get rich and the fortress survives." Beatrice stared at the line of starving boys, then back at her bastard sister. "If your street smarts fail," Beatrice said, completely detached, "I will ensure your mother is the first one Valdir visits." "I don't plan on failing," Ines said. Chapter 3: The Cost of Loyalty. The eastern sea cave smelled of brine and rotting kelp, and the sharp, chemical tang of cheap lamp oil. Ines crouched beside a stack of salt-crusted timber crates at the cave mouth, watching two Racha Guild smugglers load grain sacks onto a narrow, flat-bottomed skiff. The men worked quickly, their movements practiced, and neither of them looked at her while she counted the sacks. 14. Beatrice had paid for 20. "That's short," Ines said. The older smuggler, a thick-necked man with a kelp-stained leather apron, didn't stop lifting. Price went up. The night watch added a third rotation since the embargo started. You want 20 sacks moved through a canal with triple the patrols. You pay for 20 sacks through a canal with triple the patrols. Ines pulled the leather coin purse from inside her tunic and tossed 3 more silver weights onto the nearest crate. The coins clinked against the damp wood. The smuggler looked at them, then at her, then pocketed them without comment and whistled to his partner. They loaded the remaining 6 sacks onto a second skiff. "The canal locks at the third bridge are chained at midnight," the smuggler said, pushing the first skiff into the black water with a grunt. "You've got a 2-hour window before the dawn shift checks the seals. After that, I don't know you." Ines grabbed the tow rope of the second skiff and waded into the freezing shallows, the salt water soaking her boots and biting through the canvas of her trousers. The 2 skiffs moved in tandem through the narrow cave channel, guided by the faint amber glow of the smuggler's tin lamp ahead and the muted roar of the open ocean behind. The canal system that fed the lower city was a labyrinth of cut basalt and corroded iron gates, built 2 centuries ago to move cargo up the mountain during the construction of the upper capital. Most of the channels had been sealed off when the funicular was built, but the smugglers knew which passages were still operational. They cleared the first 2 checkpoints without trouble. The canal water was shin-deep and freezing, the walls close enough that Ines could press both palms flat against the slick basalt on either side. The only sounds were the soft splash of the skiffs and the distant, metallic grinding of the city's mana pumps cycling through their overnight pressure sequence. At the third bridge, the smuggler killed his lamp. Ines stopped moving. She could hear boots on stone above them, the rhythmic, synchronized pattern of a patrol. "Militia," the smuggler whispered, barely audible over the water. He was already untying his skiff from the tow line. "That's your problem, not mine. I was paid to load and move. The canal is yours from here." He pushed his empty skiff backward into the darkness without another word, and the faint scrape of wood on stone faded until Ines was alone with 20 sacks of grain. She waited until the patrol passed, counting the interval. 40 seconds between passes. She grabbed the tow rope of the lead skiff and pulled both boats forward, keeping her head below the stone lip of the canal wall. She made it 30 yards past the bridge before the torch lit up the water. "Hold canal inspection, hands where I can see them." The voice came from the stone embankment above. Ines looked up into the blinding orange glare of a pitch torch and the silhouettes of 4 militia soldiers, their spears angled down toward the water. The lead figure stepped forward to the edge, and the torchlight caught his face. Nico. He looked worse than the last time she'd seen him in the enlistment line. The oversized leather breastplate hung off his shoulders. His cheekbones were sharp and shallow, but his grip on the spear was steady and his eyes were focused. Behind him, standing 30 feet back near the bridge post with his arms folded across a fur-lined coat, a heavy-set man in a velvet-trimmed tunic watched the inspection with bored authority. Tiago's quartermaster. Ines raised her hand slowly, palms open, the tow rope still looped around her right wrist. "Nico," she said quietly, "it's me." Nico's jaw tightened. He glanced over his shoulder at the quartermaster, then back at Ines. "Cargo declaration," he said, his voice flat. "What's in the boats?" "You know what's in the boats," Ines said. "It's grain, it's food. The same food the fortress needs to survive the week. Nico, listen to me." "I don't know you," Nico said. He gripped the spear with both hands, angling the tip toward her chest. His voice cracked on the name. "I knew a boy from the harbor who shared fried dough and lied to my face for 4 years. Turns out the boy was a Monteiro bitch cosplaying as a lowly fisherman." The words hit harder than Ines expected. She kept her hands up, the freezing canal water swirling around her knees. "I wasn't lying to hurt you. I was hiding to survive." "You had Monteiro blood in your veins the entire time," Nico spat. He was shaking, and it could have been the cold or the rage building behind his eyes. "We were foundry rats scraping soot off our arms for half a copper bit a day, and you were playing dress-up, mocking us. You never bothered to be honest with us. Not once." "Because they would have killed me if anyone found out," Ines said. "And now they dressed you in silk and sent you down here to play spy," Nico said. He stepped closer to the edge, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that the quartermaster couldn't hear. "I can't help you, Enzo. I eat because of Tiago. My squad eats because of Tiago. If I let you through, the quartermaster reports it, and we starve to death or worse." "Nico!" "Confiscate the cargo," Nico called over his shoulder, loud enough for the quartermaster to hear. The 3 other militia soldiers scrambled down the embankment toward the water, their spears clattering against the stone. Ines yanked the tow rope free from her wrist and threw herself backward into the deeper section of the canal, the freezing water closing over her shoulders. She kicked hard against the stone floor, propelling herself toward the drainage arch where the canal split into 2 narrow channels. Behind her she heard shouting. The quartermaster's voice cut through the noise, sharp and authoritative. "After her, she's running to the south channel. Move." Boots pounded on the stone above. Ines hauled herself up out of the water at the drainage fork, her soaked clothes dragging on her limbs, and ran. The canal maintenance corridor was barely wide enough for one person. She scraped her shoulders against the basalt walls with every stride, the distant orange glow of the militia torches bouncing off the wet stone behind her. They were gaining on her. She could hear Nico's voice among them calling directions. "Left at the junction. She knows the drainage layout, cut off the cistern exit." He was helping them. He was actively guiding the patrol toward her. Ines felt a cold, sickening twist in her stomach as she ran, her boots slapping against the wet stone, her lungs burning from the freezing air. The corridor opened into a wider maintenance junction where 3 channels converged. Ines knew this spot. She and Nico and Miro had hidden here as children during the harbor floods, pressing their backs against the walls while the overflow water surged past their ankles. There was a gap in the wall, a narrow crack between 2 basalt blocks where the mortar had crumbled away decades ago, just wide enough for her to squeeze through into the dead space behind the old cistern housing. Ines dropped to her knees and pushed herself through the gap, the rough stone tearing at her tunic and scraping the skin off her forearms. She pressed herself flat against the interior wall, her chest heaving, her hand clamped over her own mouth to muffle her breathing. The torchlight flooded the junction outside. She heard the boots stop. She heard the soldiers checking the 3 channel openings, their spears scraping against the walls. "She went down the south drain," one of them said. "The grate is loose at the bottom. She's already through." "Check it," the quartermaster's voice ordered from further back. Through the crack in the wall, Ines saw Nico standing at the junction. He was facing the south channel, his back half turned toward the gap where she was hiding. He stepped toward the south drain, pointed his torch down the corridor, and called out to the quartermaster. "The grate's been propped open. She went through. We won't catch her in the overflow tunnels at night." Then he turned his head. just slightly, just enough that the torchlight caught his eyes as they flicked toward the crack in the wall. He held the glance for less than a second. Then he turned away, following the patrol toward the south drain, his voice calling orders to check the overflow exits. Ines stayed pressed against the cistern wall for 20 minutes after the torchlight faded. Her hands were shaking. The grain was gone. The operation had failed before a single sack reached the mountain. But as she sat in the dark, her back against the cold, damp stone, she noticed something she hadn't been looking for. Through the drainage grate above her head, she could hear the militia soldiers returning to their checkpoint. She could hear them logging the confiscated grain in the quartermaster's ledger. She could hear the soldiers asking when they would get their share. She heard the quartermaster laugh. "You get your half loaf at dawn, same as always. The grain goes up the mountain to Lord Tiago's personal stores. That's the arrangement." 20 sacks of grain, enough to feed the militia patrol for a week, and the soldiers who had confiscated it would see exactly none of it. Ines filed that information away and waited for nightfall. In the upper fortress, Beatriz Monteiro read the coded report on the resonance slate 3 times before setting it face down on her desk. Her chief counselor, an elderly man named Feria, whose political instincts had kept 3 successive patriarchs from making catastrophic alliances, stood on the opposite side of the study, his hands folded inside his heavy wool sleeves. "The bastard's grain was intercepted," Feria said. "All 20 sacks confiscated by Tiago's militia." Beatriz pressed her numb fingers against the edge of her desk. She didn't look surprised. She looked like a woman reading the result of an equation she had already solved. "And Tiago's patrol response?" Beatriz asked. 4 minutes from alert to full canal lockdown," Feria said. 12 soldiers mobilized within a 6-block radius. The quartermaster directed from the 3rd bridge personally. Beatriz nodded slowly. "The checkpoint rotation schedule. 40-second intervals on the canal level, 2-minute intervals on the embankment. The quartermaster stays at the bridge post and doesn't enter the water." Feria paused. "My lady, may I ask why you sent the girl on a run you clearly expected to fail?" Beatriz looked at him. "Because I needed Tiago's response mapped, and I wasn't going to risk my own agents to get it. The girl gave me the patrol density, the response time, and the chain of command structure for the entire lower canal district in a single night, and it cost me nothing but 20 sacks of grain I was going to lose anyway." Feria's expression didn't change, but his hands shifted inside his sleeves. "And if she doesn't recover from the failure, then she is useless to me and I will find another way to break the embargo," Beatriz said. She pulled a second resonance slate from the drawer, this one displaying a map of the lower city with small, pulsing amber dots marking troop positions. "What concerns me more is Valdir. His outriders have been circling the lower terraces since yesterday. The dragon hasn't eaten in 6 days. If Valdir decides to raid the lower city for livestock, he will run directly through Tiago's militia lines, and I will have a civil war on this mountain within 48 hours. She set the slate down and looked at the ceiling, where the faint vibration of the dragon's restless pacing hummed through the stone. "The girl has 24 hours, Beatriz said. "If she can't find a way past Tiago's blockade by tomorrow night, she'll be on her own and will prepare for war." Tiago Monteiro sat on the edge of his bed in the sealed eastern wing, turning a thin glass vial of clear liquid between his fingers. The room was warm. Unlike the rest of the fortress, Tiago's private quarters had a secondary heating system that drew from the geothermal vents beneath the caldera floor. The walls were lined with heavy, dark velvet that absorbed sound. The door had 3 locks, all of them engaged. He had read the quartermaster's report twice. 20 sacks of grain confiscated from his bastard sister's amateur smuggling operation in the lower canals. The grain was already in his personal stores. Beatriz would learn about the loss within the hour if she didn't already know. He set the report on the bedside table and waited. The 3rd lock disengaged from the outside. The door opened and closed quickly, and the locks re-engaged. Commander Dario crossed the room without speaking. He moved with the precise, economical efficiency of a man who had spent his adult life in the Royal Shadow Guards, Minister Silva's personal enforcement division. His dark uniform was buttoned to the throat. There was a fresh laceration across his left forearm, the sleeve cut open, and the wound still seeping through a hastily tied cloth bandage. "Sit down," Tiago said. "I have 11 minutes before the shift rotation," Dario said, his voice flat and controlled. "Silva moved the patrol schedule up by an hour. He's getting more careful." "Sit down," Tiago repeated. Dario looked at him for a moment, then sat on the edge of the bed. He didn't relax. He sat the way he stood, upright, alert, his weight on his feet, ready to move. Tiago reached for the bedside basin, where a clean cloth soaked in warm water. He took Dario's left arm without asking, untying the crude bandage with careful, practiced fingers. The laceration was shallow but long, running from the inside of Dario's wrist to mid-forearm. "Training accident," Dario said. "You don't have training accidents," Tiago said. He pressed the warm cloth against the wound and held it there, his thumb resting against the inside of Dario's wrist where the pulse beat steady under the skin. He cleaned the cut slowly, wiping away the dried blood with small, deliberate strokes, rinsing the cloth twice in the basin. Dario didn't flinch. He watched Tiago work with the same flat, assessing gaze he used during tactical briefings. "Silva reassigned 2 of my operatives today," Dario said. "He told them it was a routine rotation. It isn't. He's isolating the agents who have been in proximity to the Monteiro intelligence stream. He's narrowing the leak." Tiago's hand paused on the cloth. He pressed his forehead against Dario's shoulder, his fingers still wrapped around his forearm. He stayed there for several seconds, his breathing shallow. "I can redirect the intelligence through a secondary channel," Tiago said, his voice muffled against the dark fabric of Dario's uniform. "I'll feed it through the Merchant Guild contacts instead. Silva won't trace it to you." "You are being reckless," Dario said. He didn't lean into the contact. He didn't pull away either. He sat still, his jaw tight, his free hand resting flat on his own thigh. "The intelligence I've been passing you is the only reason you've been able to outmaneuver Beatriz on the territorial votes. If Silva traces it, he won't care about your family name. He will execute me for treason, and the crown will strip your territorial claims within a week." "I won't let that happen," Tiago said. He lifted his head and pressed his palm flat against the side of Dario's face, turning it toward him. His touch was gentle. Dario held his gaze for a moment. Then he reached up and removed Tiago's hand from his face, setting it back on the bed between them. 11 minutes, Dario said. He stood, rebuttoning his sleeve over the freshly cleaned wound. He crossed the room to the door without looking back. Tiago sat on the edge of the bed, his hands empty, the warmth from Dario's skin still fading from his fingertips. He looked at the basin of pink-tinged water, then at the door, and he stayed there long after the locks re-engaged from the outside. The warm cloth cooled in his hands. He folded it carefully and set it beside the basin. Ines found Nico in a cellar tavern 2 streets from the militia barracks, 4 hours after the failed canal run. The tavern was a converted storage vault cut into the basalt foundation of a decommissioned salt warehouse. The ceiling was low enough that Ines had to duck through the entrance. A single tallow candle burned on each of the 4 rough timber tables, and the air was thick with the sour smell of cheap fermented cane wine and the damp wool of wet coats drying on wall hooks. Nico was sitting alone at the table nearest the back wall, hunched over a wooden cup. He was still wearing the militia breastplate. The half-loaf of stale bread the quartermaster had issued sat untouched on the table in front of him. Ines sat down across from him without asking. Nico looked up, his face was tight. "You shouldn't be here." "And yet here I am," Ines said. She kept her voice low, pitched just above the ambient noise of the tavern. "You pointed the patrol away from me at the junction. Thank you for doing that." Nico's jaw flexed. He wrapped both hands around his wooden cup and stared into the dark liquid. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Fine," Ines said. "Then let me talk about something you do know." She reached across the table and tapped the untouched half-loaf of bread with her finger. 20 sacks of grain were confiscated tonight, Enough to feed your patrol squad for a week. How much of it ended up on this table? Nico didn't answer. Half a loaf, Ines said. The same half loaf you get every morning whether you confiscate 20 sacks or nothing. Tiago's quartermaster logged the cargo and sent it up the mountain to Tiago's personal stores. Your squad did the work. Tiago ate the profit. That's how the contract works, Nico said, but his voice had lost its edge. That's how the contract works for you, Ines said. She leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table. It doesn't have to be. Tomorrow night, another shipment comes through the third bridge canal. Same time, same route. When it hits your checkpoint, you let it pass. Your squad takes 20% of the cargo off the top. Real grain, Nico, full sacks. Enough to feed your entire patrol properly for the first time since you signed that enlistment paper. Nico looked at her. The hardness in his face was cracking, and underneath it was the hollow, desperate exhaustion of a boy who had been hungry for 3 weeks straight. And if Tiago finds out? Nico asked. Tiago sits in a heated room in the upper fortress eating roasted quail, Ines said. He doesn't count the sacks himself. The quartermaster counts them. As long as the quartermaster's numbers match the patrol logs, Tiago never knows the difference. You report a smaller interception, you keep the gap, everybody eats. Nico picked up the half-loaf and turned it over in his hands. The bread was gray and dense, flecked with ash from the oven. He set it back down on the table. If this goes wrong, Nico said quietly, they won't just kill me, they'll kill my whole squad. If you keep eating half-loaves for meals, Ines said, you won't last the winter anyway. Nico stared at the bread for a long time. The tallow candle guttered between them, sending thin trails of smoke toward the low stone ceiling. 20%, he said. 20%, Ines confirmed. She stood up and left the tavern without looking back. The freezing rain was still falling on the cobblestones outside, and the basalt mana strips in the road had dimmed to their overnight amber. Somewhere high above the fog, the faint vibration of the dragon's restless pacing hummed through the wet air. The first run had failed, but she had learned 2 things that were worth more than 20 sacks of grain. Tiago's militia was held together by hunger and fear, and hunger was a currency she could exploit. I hope you are enjoying this story so far. Let me know in the comments below if you would like a spin-off or part 2 of this story. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and to check out our Patreon page. Chapter 4, The Shadow Toll. The midnight rain over the third bridge canal tasted like salt and rusted iron. Ines crouched in the shadows of a rotting wooden pylon, the freezing water seeping through the soles of her boots. Her muscles ached with a deep, lactic burn, the adrenaline of the last hour slowly crashing into exhaustion. Across the narrow stretch of black water, 2 heavy-bottomed skiffs bumped against the stone wharf. They were sitting low, weighed down by 50 burlap sacks of eastern sea cave grain. Standing between the skiffs and the narrow alleyway leading to the mountain's base was Nico, flanked by 6 shivering boys in Tiago's oversized provincial militia armor. Ines didn't step out with her hands raised this time. She stepped out holding a heavy leather satchel. She tossed it onto the wet cobblestones at Nico's feet. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. Nico stared at it, the tip of his rusted spear trembling slightly in his blue fingers. He nudged the satchel open with his boot. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were thick slabs of heavily salted, high-grade cured pork and a handful of stamped silver weights, meat and money, the kind of wealth Tiago had never once provided. 20%, Ines said, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the rain. She kept her posture loose, hooking her thumbs into her belt. She wasn't begging a friend, she was negotiating a contract. You let the skiffs through to the cliff base. You log an interception of 10 sacks for Tiago's quartermaster so the ledger math balances. You and your squad keep the pork and the silver. Tomorrow night we do it again. Nico looked at the meat. He looked at the half-starved boys standing behind him, their eyes wide and desperate in the gloom. Then he looked at the distant, imposing silhouette of the upper capital. He didn't say a word. He just knelt, scooped up the satchel and jerked his head toward the alley. The militia parted, clearing the path. Ines exhaled a slow, shaky breath. The corruption of Tiago's army had officially begun. But getting the grain past the blockade was only half the battle. By the time Ines reached the sheer basalt base of the high house cliffs, her hands were numb. She dragged the heavy burlap sacks into the narrow, claustrophobic cavern that housed the fortress's geothermal exhaust vents. The air in here was stiflingly hot, smelling of sulfur and old grease. She stood beneath the iron grate of the primary laundry chute, untying the thick hemp ropes she had spent hours dropping down from her bedroom the day before. It was brutal mechanical labor. She tied a slipknot around the neck of the first burlap sack, yanked the rope twice to signal the terrified maid 3,000 feet above, and braced her boots against the stone as the rope went taut. The heavy iron pulleys far above groaned, the gears biting into the rust. Hauling the grain up the interior spine of the mountain took hours. By the time the final sack ascended into the dark, Ines's knuckles were bleeding freely, the skin stripped raw by the friction of the hemp. She left the cavern just as the pale, gray light of dawn began to bleed over the Atlantic. Walking back through the lower market toward her designated safe house, she kept her head down, pulling her collar up against the chill. The slum was waking up. Carts were being pushed, braziers were being lit. As she passed a narrow alley near the baker's square, an old woman tending a small coal fire stopped stirring her iron pot. The woman didn't shout. She didn't bow. She simply reached out with a pair of iron tongs, lifted a blisteringly hot, roasted root from the coals, and slid it directly into the oversized pocket of Ines's coat as she walked by. "Safe paths, Enzo," the old woman murmured, turning her eyes back to the fire before a patrolling guard could notice. Ines kept walking, wrapping her freezing fingers around the burning heat of the root through the canvas of her pocket. It wasn't a grand parade, but in a starving city, giving away food was the ultimate act of kindness. She wasn't just a bastard sister anymore. She was becoming an anchor. Far above the slums, in the subterranean holding cells of the Crown's diplomatic wing, the air was immaculately dry and smelled faintly of lye. Commander Dario stood in the center of the interrogation room. He wore his royal shadow guard armor, matte black steel over dark velvet, tailored so perfectly it didn't make a sound when he moved. His posture was rigid, perfectly aligned, his expression utterly blank. Bound to the heavy iron chair in front of him was a minor scribe from the Ministry of Ledgers. The man was weeping softly, a dark stain spreading across the knees of his trousers. Dario did not pace. He did not yell. He held a small, glowing resonance slate in his left hand, tapping a measured, rhythmic beat against the edge of the glass. "You routed 4 encrypted messages to House Monteiro regarding the Crown's troop movements," Dario said. His voice was a flat, unbothered baritone, lacking any theatrical malice. "I was coerced," the scribe sobbed, straining against the leather straps. "They threatened my daughters. Please, Commander, I only." Dario set the resonance slate down on a small metal table. He picked up a pair of heavy, iron-jawed pincers, the metal cold and unyielding. "The Crown does not recognize coercion as a substitute for loyalty," Dario said calmly. He stepped forward, grasping the scribe's left index finger with the iron jaws. He didn't hesitate or wind up. He simply applied a burst of terrifying, mechanical leverage. The bone snapped with a sickening, wet crack that echoed off the tile walls. The scribe screamed, thrashing violently in the chair. Dario stepped back smoothly, entirely avoiding the spray of blood, his velvet coat remaining pristine. He picked the resonance slate back up. "Name your contact in House Monteiro," Dario said, his voice completely unchanged, "or we will proceed to the thumb." He was a machine of deliberate, calculated violence. This was the commander of the shadows. Dario was a man who possessed no blind spots, except, perhaps, for the sociopathic air currently tearing the lower city apart. The fortress was finally functioning again. Beatrice sat in her study, drinking a cup of hot, spiced tea. It was the first time in 3 weeks the porcelain had actually held heat. The kitchens were operating. Ines's shadow toll had bypassed the merchants entirely, dragging enough grain up the mountain's spine to restabilize the loyalist guard and feed the political counselors. But the victory felt hollow. because the glass of the window panes was currently vibrating in its lead casing. The low, rhythmic thudding of massive, leathery wings hammered the air outside. Beatrice walked to the window, looking out over the terrace. Valdir's dragon eclipsed the morning sun. The beast was no longer starving. Valdir had fed it on the slaughtered livestock of the lower plains. He didn't attack the fortress. He didn't burn the docks. Instead, he flew the massive, armored nightmare in low, tightening circles directly over the estates of the minor provincial lords. It was a perfectly executed campaign of psychological terror. He was blotting out their sky, letting the heat of the beast's breath wither their gardens, reminding them exactly who controlled the ultimate weapon of the region. The door to the study opened. Feria, Beatrice's chief adjutant, stepped inside, holding a heavy parchment sealed with Valdir's iron signet. "He isn't attacking, my lady," Feria said, her voice tight as she handed the parchment over. Beatrice broke the seal, scanning the heavy ink script, her jaw locked. Valdir wasn't a rabid dog. He was a blunt force tactician. He was using the terror of the dragon to force a legal victory. "He has formally petitioned the crown for a council vote," Beatrice said, dropping the parchment onto her desk. "He claims my diplomatic mandate has failed because of the embargo. He is calling for a vote to dissolve my authority and consolidate the house entirely under his military command." "Can he win the vote?" Feria asked. Beatrice looked back out the window, watching the shadow of the dragon drag across the lower city. "He's been intimidating the minor lords for a week. If the vote were held yesterday, they would have handed him the keys out of pure terror. And today—" Beatrice looked down at her cup of hot tea. "Today, our loyalists have food in their stomachs, courtesy of our dearest little sister. A starving man votes for the man with the sword. A fed man votes for the status quo." Beatrice tightened her grip on the porcelain. "We have to hold a meeting with the councillors immediately. The vote happens in 2 days. If Ines's pipeline collapses before then, Valdir will take the house and we will all burn." Chapter 5: The Council Vote. The sealed eastern wing was quiet enough to hear the frost cracking against the leaded window panes. Tiago laid on his back in the dark, one arm folded behind his head, staring at the vaulted ceiling. Geothermal heat rising from the deep caldera vents made the stone sweat, tracing thin, glistening trails down the masonry. Beside him, Dario was lying on his side, his back turned to Tiago. He was still wearing his uniform trousers and his black undershirt. He hadn't removed his boots. He never did. "You could stay longer tonight," Tiago said. He kept his voice low, stripped of the smiling, aristocratic cadence he used for the rest of the world. "Silva pulled the midnight inspection from your rotation. I checked." "You checked my rotation schedule," Dario remarked. "I check everything that dictates how long I get to keep you in a room." Dario didn't answer. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant, rhythmic hum of the dragon pacing in the pits far below. Tiago turned onto his side, facing the broad line of Dario's back. He reached out, pressing his palm flat between Dario's shoulder blades, feeling the iron wire tension permanently locked in the muscle there. "When this is over," Tiago whispered, "I am taking you to the southern coast. There's a cove past the fishing villages where the water is warm enough to swim at night. No resonance lamps, no patrol schedules, just us and nature." Dario exhaled, a slow, measured breath. "When this is over, Tiago, I will either be stationed in the capital or buried under it." "That isn't the answer I am looking for, Dario." "It is the only answer my uniform allows." Tiago slid closer, pressing his forehead against the nape of Dario's neck. He could feel the pulse there, steady, slow, the heartbeat of a man who had trained himself to remain utterly calm while the world burned around him. Tiago closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of him, the metallic residue of polished armor, the salt of exertion, the faint, living warmth beneath it. "I would burn every alliance I have to keep you safe," Tiago whispered. "I know," Dario said softly. "That is exactly what terrifies me." Then so quietly that Tiago almost missed it, Dario shifted. His hand found Tiago's. It wasn't his usual touch, controlled, deliberate, and absolute. His fingers curled loosely around Tiago's wrist, his calloused thumb resting heavily against the heel of Tiago's palm. He held on for 3 seconds, a silent, desperate anchor. Then Dario released his grip, sat up, and reached for his jacket. Tiago stayed on his side, watching Dario fasten his cuffs. The warmth where Dario's thumb had pressed against his wrist lingered, burning like a brand. Dario stood, pausing at the heavy oak door. He rested his hand on the iron lock but did not turn back to look at the bed. "Be careful with the vote tomorrow," Dario said, his voice back to the flat baritone of a royal commander. "Silva is counting heads. If Valdir loses, the crown will not intervene to save the military pillar. Silva wants to see which way the mountain falls before he places his weight. Make sure to survive the day." The locks disengaged with a heavy clack. The door opened, letting in a draft of freezing hall air, and closed. Tiago lay in the dark, sliding his hand across the sheets to rest on the warm indent Dario had left in the mattress. The next morning, at dawn, Beatriz intercepted Ines in the servant corridors. Ines was hauling a heavy canvas sack of dried maize over her shoulder, her boots slipping slightly on the damp flagstone as she headed toward the lower staff quarters. She didn't see Beatriz until the older woman stepped out from the shadow of a stone archway, completely blocking the narrow passage. "The dockworkers in the lower city have given you a nickname," Beatriz said. "No greeting, no preamble. They are calling you the Canal Girl. The fish merchants on Dock Row are telling the militia that a dead boy named Enzo is the reason they ate last week." Ines stopped, shifting the crushing weight of the maize sack to her other shoulder. "That's because I am. It stops today." Ines looked at her, wiping a streak of sweat and coal dust from her forehead. "You want me to stop feeding your loyalists?" "I want you to stop being visible," Beatriz said, stepping closer, her voice dropping into a harsh, clipping rhythm. "You are an instrument, Ines. You move the grain, you balance the ledgers. You do not become a public figure. The moment the starving masses attach your face to the food supply, you become a political symbol, and political symbols attract the attention of people whose only skill set is killing." Ines didn't step back. "The people in the lower city don't care about politics, Beatriz. They care about surviving." "Everyone cares about politics," Beatriz countered smoothly. "They just don't know it until someone puts a spear in their freezing hands and points them at my gates." She reached out and adjusted the coarse hemp strap of the maize sack on Ines's shoulder. It was a quick, impersonal gesture, calculating the load. "Valdir's council vote is at midday. If he wins, the diplomatic seal dissolves, and my legal protection over you and your mother in Ribeira evaporates with it. Having your name in the mouths of dockworkers is a liability I cannot afford." "Then what do you want me to do?" Ines asked, her jaw tightening. "Run the pipeline, keep the grain moving, and ensure the credit lands squarely on the Monteiro crest, not on the Canal Girl." Beatriz turned, the heavy silk of her skirt sweeping against the stone, and began to walk away. She paused at the corner. "The next shipment, double it. I need those provincial lords fed, warm, and deeply grateful before they sit in those chairs." Beatriz disappeared down the corridor. Ines stood alone in the drafty hall, the maize sack digging a painful trench into her collarbone. She ran the calculation in her head. Beatriz was right that visibility was a target on her back, but Beatriz was wrong that it was worthless. The dockworkers and fish merchants didn't give a damn about the Monteiro crest. They followed the hand that handed them the bread. It was a currency Beatriz couldn't understand, because Beatriz had never been hungry. Ines adjusted her grip on the sack and kept walking. The Council of Provincial Lords convened in the Grand Caldera Hall at midday. The chamber was freezing. The heating stones embedded in the marble floor had been dead for a week, and the 12 assembled lords sat huddled in heavy wolf fur coats, their breath pluming in the thin mountain air. They were arranged in a half-circle facing the raised dais. Behind the executor's podium, a massive obsidian panel displayed the formal petition in glowing amber script, a motion to dissolve the diplomatic seal authority and transfer all inter-house governance to the military tribunal. Valdir stood on the left side of the chamber. He was fully armored in dark steel, his arms folded across his chest, flanked by a tight formation of heavy infantry. He watched the lords file in with the patient, coiled stillness of a man who was confident to win. Beatrice sat on the right side, her posture rigidly perfect, her gloved hands resting lightly on a leather portfolio. Feria stood silently behind her chair. Ines was not in the chamber. She was standing in the dark servant corridor behind the obsidian panel, peering through a narrow, grated ventilation slit. Her raw fingers gripped the freezing iron bars as the executor raised his staff and struck the floor. The petition was read, the vote was called. Lord Cassius voted in favor. Lord Braga voted in favor. The votes moved down the line. Ines counted silently, her pulse hammering against her ribs. 6 in favor, 3 against, 3 lords remaining. Lord Ferreira stood up. He controlled the southern limestone quarries and had been terrified by Valdir's dragon flyovers for a week. He was a small man, his face carved with deep lines of quarry dust. He looked at Valdir's armor and with trembling hands voted against. The silence in the chamber suddenly thickened. Valdir's jaw locked, a muscle ticking violently in his cheek. Lord Duarte stood and voted against. Lord Oliveira was the last. A heavy-set man who had been wavering for weeks, he looked down for a long, agonizing moment. He voted against. 6 in favor, 6 against. The motion failed to reach the two-thirds majority. The diplomatic seal authority stood. Beatrice didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply unclasped her hands, opened her leather portfolio, and nodded once to Feria. Across the room, Valdir did not draw his sword. He didn't shout. He stood perfectly still for a while. Then he turned, his steel boots ringing like hammer strikes against the marble, and walked directly toward the courtyard archways. His infantry parted instantly to let him through. He didn't look at the lords who had betrayed him. He walked out into the open, freezing air of the volcanic courtyard. The Patriarch's dragon was waiting, its massive head lifting at the scent of its rider's fury. Through the ventilation slit, Ines watched him grab the harness and mount the beast. Valdir didn't signal a gentle takeoff. He drove his spurs in. The dragon launched from the basalt with a concussive, explosive blast of displaced air. The shockwave hit the grand hall, violently shattering 3 of the towering stained glass panels. Shards of colored glass rained down onto the marble. Lords threw their arms over their heads, screaming and diving out of their chairs. Beatrice sat perfectly still at her desk, staring at the empty archway as the glass settled around her. Ines pressed her back against the cold stone of the corridor wall and exhaled a shaky breath. The vote had held. But as the terrifying roar of the dragon echoed down the mountain passes, Ines understood the reality of this wicked game. Valdir hadn't lost. He had simply been told that the laws of men wouldn't give him the kingdom. And Valdir had never been a man who accepted a closed door when he possessed the power to burn down the wall. Chapter 6: The Fracture. The dragon hit the lower docks at dawn. Ines was standing in the dried fish stall, counting silver weights into the old woman's palm, when the shadow swallowed the harbor. It moved with terrifying speed, a black shape the size of a merchant galleon blotting out the early sun. A concussive blast of displaced air hit a second later, violently stripping the waxed paper bundles off the counter and sending the iron oil lamp spinning across the wet cobblestones. The roar came next. It wasn't the distant, muffled rumble she was used to hearing from the upper caldera. This was a tearing, physical wall of sound that hit her sternum like a sledgehammer and made the roots of her teeth vibrate. At the harbor landing stage, the armored wyvern couriers shrieked and thrashed against their iron tethers, their leathery wings beating the air in blind, absolute panic. The first stream of fire struck the canal bridge at the 3rd checkpoint. The bridge didn't just burn, it detonated. The ancient basalt stonework superheated and cracked apart in a spray of molten rock and boiling, foul canal water. The steam cloud that erupted from the impact point shot 60 feet into the air, instantly burying the harbor in a scalding, white-gray fog that tasted of sulfur and charred algae. Ines grabbed the old woman by the shoulder, dragging her down behind the stall's heavy stone foundation. Around them, the lower docks dissolved into screaming chaos. Dockworkers abandoned their pulleys and sprinted away from the waterfront. Tiago's militia soldiers threw down their spears and ran. A heavy cargo cart overturned, spilling dried grain across the slick stones, and starving people dove for the loose sacks with the desperate, clawing frenzy of cornered animals. The dragon banked, circling back over the water. Through the thinning steam, Ines saw it clearly, charcoal scales reflecting the orange morning light, wings spread wide enough to cast a shadow over 3 city blocks. Valdir was mounted at the base of its neck, his heavy steel armor gleaming through the smoke. He wasn't aiming at Beatrice's military targets. He was burning the infrastructure. The second blast of liquid fire hit the funicular platform. The heavy iron grating Ines had used to hoist grain up the mountain buckled and sheared, the steel cables snapping with a deafening whip crack. The cargo pulley housing exploded outward in a shower of splintered timber and twisted, glowing iron. Ines pressed her back against the wet stone wall, her ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. Her mind raced, bypassing terror entirely and slamming straight into logistical math. The third bridge was gone. The funicular loading dock was gone. 2 of her 3 smuggling routes had just been incinerated in 90 seconds. The dragon banked hard toward the southern terraces, its massive chest expanding to draw breath for a third pass over the warehouses. Then the resonance bolts hit. 3 heavy, blue-white streaks of concentrated mana lanced downward from the upper fortress walls, tearing through the fog and striking the air around the beast in rapid succession. The air pressure snapped. The dragon shrieked, rolling violently sideways as the third bolt grazed the membrane of its left wing, punching a smoking, 6-foot tear through the leathery skin. Valdir yanked the driving chains hard to the right, forcing the beast into a steep, desperate climb away from the city. From her position in the mud, Ines looked up at the towering silhouette of the fortress. The heavy resonance cannons mounted along the lower battlements were fully manned. Beatrice's garrison was positioned, loaded, and firing in coordinated mechanical volleys. Beatrice had anticipated the tantrum. The cannons fired again, lighting the fog with strobing blue flashes. The dragon twisted in the air, struggling to gain altitude above the effective firing range. A 4th bolt caught the beast in the hindquarter. It let out a sound Ines had never heard before, a high, rattling howl that sounded nothing like a god and exactly like a bleeding animal. The beast lurched, losing altitude, its torn wing failing to catch the updraft. Valdir dragged the dragon toward the outer mountains, retreating over the ridgeline. The last Ines saw of them was a dark shape trailing thick black smoke against the pale sky, listing badly to the left before disappearing into the volcanic peaks. The harbor fell silent, save for the hiss of steam rising from the boiled canal and the groaning of the twisted funicular rails. Ines stood up, her knees trembling slightly. The waterfront was devastated, but the people in the mud weren't running anymore. They were moving. Dockworkers were already pulling burning timber away from the intact warehouse walls. A group of Tiago's militia soldiers, Nico's squad among them, had stripped off their oversized armor and were forming a bucket line from the harbor to the nearest fire. The old fishwoman was back on her feet, shouting harsh orders at 2 younger men to salvage the grain that had spilled from the overturned cart. Nobody was waiting for the high houses to send aid. Nobody was looking up at the fortress for guidance. They were organizing themselves, moving with the brutal efficiency of people who had finally realized that authority was never coming to save them. A dockworker Ines recognized from the timber yard jogged past her, a sloshing bucket of seawater in each hand. He stopped just long enough to lock eyes with her. "The East Canal is still intact," he said, his face smeared with soot. "The sea cave entrance wasn't hit. If you can get the skiffs rerouted to the overflow tunnels by tonight, my crew will haul the sacks by hand." He didn't wait for her permission. He kept running toward the fire. The lower city had just been attacked by a dragon, and their immediate response was to protect the supply line. Ines felt a cold, terrifying weight settle in her chest. It wasn't pride. It was the realization that these people had just quietly seceded from the Monteiro mandate, and they had chosen her as their anchor. 3,000 feet above the smoke, Beatrice Monteiro stared at a brass resonance slate on her desk. Feria stood on the opposite side of the room, her uniform smelling faintly of ozone from the cannons. "The beast is grounded," Feria reported. Valdir retreated to the outer volcanic outposts. He took his 300 heavy infantry with him. He won't be able to fly that dragon again for weeks. Beatrice didn't smile. She tapped a silk-gloved finger against the edge of the desk. "And the lower city." Feria hesitated. "The fires are contained, but the political situation has fractured. The dockworkers have boarded up the merchant stalls. They are refusing to pay the guild tariffs. Worse, Tiago's militia is collapsing. We have reports of entire squads tearing up their enlistment contracts in the central plaza." "A riot," Beatrice said flatly. "An organization," Feria corrected, her voice dropping. "They aren't looting, my lady. They are barricading the East Canal to protect the smuggling routes. They are telling the enforcers that they answer only to the canal authority." Beatrice stopped tapping her finger. The room was perfectly silent. She had used Ines to feed the city, thinking the bastard was nothing more than a wrench to fix a broken pipe. But the wrench had just become a weapon. The moment the lower city realized the dragon could bleed, the fear that held the iron canopy together evaporated. And Ines was standing right in the center of the vacuum. In the outer volcanic range, Valdir Monteiro sat on an ammunition crate inside a freezing stone bunker. He didn't flinch as the field surgeon pulled a curved iron needle through the deep, jagged burn across his left forearm, a parting gift from the dragon's thrashing, damaged wing. The bunker smelled of medical alcohol and old ash. Valdir wasn't looking at the wound. He was looking at the glowing amber script of a resonance dispatch slate resting on his knee. It was from Tiago. The message was brief, stripped of all of Tiago's usual aristocratic poetry. "My quartermaster was beaten unconscious by dockworkers. The militia is deserting. The lower city is lost. We need to talk." Valdir exhaled a slow breath, watching the amber light reflect off his dented armor. His political gambit had failed at the council. His beast was crippled. His heavy infantry was isolated in the mountains. And Tiago, the smiling sociopath who thought he could control the slums, was suddenly on the back foot. "How long before the beast can bear weight?" Valdir asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. The surgeon tied off the suture and snipped the heavy thread. 3 weeks, my lord. The wing membrane must knit. If you force a launch before then, the tear will split to the bone and the beast will fall." 3 weeks grounded. His bastard sister's pipeline had survived his fire, and Beatrice was sitting safely behind her cannons. Valdir picked up the resonance slate. He didn't ask Tiago what he wanted. He didn't offer sympathy. He dipped his thumb in the activation ink and wrote a single word back to his brother. "Where?" Chapter 7, The Puppet Strings. They met in a stripped-out mining outpost 3 miles east of the fortress, where the volcanic rock gave way to loose scree and the air tasted of sulfur. Valdir was already seated when Tiago arrived. He looked diminished without the dragon behind him, just a massive man in scorched steel armor with a fresh, bloody burn dressing visible beneath his collar. 2 of his heavy infantry officers flanked him, their hands resting on their sword pommels. Tiago entered the bunker with Dario 1 step behind him. He didn't bring guards. He sat down across the rough timber table from his brother, adjusting the cuffs of his immaculate velvet coat, and folded his hands neatly in front of him. "Your militia is collapsing," Valdir said. No greeting. His voice was a raw, smoke-damaged rasp. "Your beast is compromised," Tiago replied. He smiled. It was the same warm, effortless smile he used on provincial lords and terrified commoners. "We're both bleeding, brother. The question is whether we die separately or bandage a solution together." Valdir leaned forward, the timber table groaning under his weight. "I have 300 heavy infantry, armored cavalry, and a beast that will be airborne again soon. What do you bring to this table besides a charming smile and a broken army?" "I bring the crown," Tiago said softly. Valdir's officers shifted. Valdir himself went entirely still. "Minister Silva has been feeding me intelligence for months," Tiago continued, letting the words land like weighted stones. This was the card he had been holding in the dark, the one piece of leverage that made him worth more alive than dead. I know the Crown's position on every territorial dispute, every trade embargo, and every succession ruling before it's announced. If you want the Crown's recognition, the fourth pillar, you need me to facilitate it. It was a total lie. Dario had been feeding Tiago the intelligence, not Silva, but Valdir didn't need to know the source. He only needed to know the pipeline existed. Valdir studied his brother's face for a long time, the firelight catching the fresh burn on his neck. "What do you want?" "Shared command," Tiago said. "Your military strength, my territorial infrastructure. We present a unified front to the Crown and petition for joint succession authority. Beatrice's diplomatic pillar gets absorbed. The bastard gets removed. And if the Crown refuses?" "The Crown won't refuse," Tiago said. "Silva is an opportunist. He'll back whichever coalition gives the Crown the most leverage over the House. Right now, Valdir, that's us." Valdir sat back. He didn't shake hands. He didn't nod. He looked at his brother with the flat, calculating gaze of a man who trusted no one. 3 weeks, Valdir said. "When the beast flies again, we move. But if your Crown intelligence is real, I want proof before I commit my infantry." "You'll have it," Tiago promised. They left the outpost through separate exits. Dario walked beside Tiago in absolute silence until they were a quarter-mile down the mountain path, out of earshot of Valdir's men. The wind was brutal here, whipping the loose scree across their boots. "You just told your brother that you have a direct line to the Crown's intelligence," Dario said. His voice was dead flat. "If he tests that claim and traces the source, it leads directly to me." "It leads to a channel," Tiago said, pulling his coat tighter against the wind. "Not to you." "Every channel has an end point," Dario said. He stopped walking, his hand dropping instinctively toward his blade. "You are gambling with my life to buy an alliance with a man who burns cities for sport." Tiago turned to face him. He didn't smile. "I am gambling with your life because it is the only way I can think of to keep you alive past the end of the month. Silva is closing in. If I don't give him a reason to keep the Crown invested in me, he'll cut me loose, and the first thing he will do is audit your department. This alliance buys us time." Dario looked at him. Whatever calculation was running behind his eyes, he kept it locked down. He turned and resumed walking down the path. Tiago followed, watching the broad line of Dario's shoulders and knowing, with absolute certainty, that he had just made the most dangerous promise of his life to the most lethal man on the mountain. In the upper fortress, Beatrice set down the intercepted resonance dispatch and looked at Ines. "Your brothers have formed an alliance," Beatrice said. Her voice was steady, but her fingers were pressed so hard against the edge of her mahogany desk that the knuckles were white. "Valdir's infantry and Tiago's territorial claims, presented as a unified succession bid. They are petitioning the Crown for joint authority." Ines was standing near the study window, her arms folded tightly across her chest. The lower city was visible through the frost-clouded glass. The rebuilt canal routes, the repaired dock infrastructure, the thin, gray columns of smoke from the foundry district where the workers had returned to their shifts under the unofficial protection of her supply network. "What does that mean for us?" Ines asked. "It means the Crown now has 2 Monteiro heirs offering it a seat at the table in exchange for recognition," Beatrice said, standing up and pacing toward the hearth. "Silva will take that offer. It gives the Crown influence over both the military and the territorial pillars without having to fight for either one." "And you?" "Irrelevant," Beatrice said bitterly. "Diplomacy only works when the alternative to negotiation is catastrophic. If Valdir and Tiago control the courts and the military, there is nothing left to negotiate over." Ines turned from the window. "So what do we do?" Beatrice didn't answer immediately. She looked at the intelligence report, then at the glowing resonance slate displaying the lower city supply routes, and finally at Ines. Something shifted behind Beatrice's eyes, not warmth, and certainly not sisterhood, but raw recognition. It was the look a general gives a foot soldier who has proven competent enough to be trusted with a suicide mission. "We prepare," Beatrice said, "and you keep the lower city fed. If it comes to a fight, the common people are the only force on this mountain that isn't owned by a Monteiro heir or a crown minister. Right now, they follow you. That may be the only advantage we have left." It was the first time Beatrice had acknowledged Ines's influence over the lower city as an asset instead of a liability. Ines nodded once, her jaw tight, and left the study. The sealed eastern wing was pitch black, save for the amber glow of the geothermal vents bleeding upward through the floor grates. Tiago locked the third heavy iron bolt behind him and turned around. Dario was already in the room. He was sitting on the edge of the mattress, his black uniform jacket removed and folded over the back of a chair. He was staring at the floorboards, his posture rigid. "You're still angry," Tiago said, dropping his coat onto a bench. "I'm not angry," Dario said, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. "I'm calculating how many days I have before your brother's intelligence test exposes the leak and Silva puts a blade through my throat." Tiago crossed the room and stood directly in front of him. He reached down, hooking 2 fingers under Dario's jaw and tilted his head up, forcing eye contact. "I won't let that happen," Tiago said. "You keep saying that," Dario whispered. "It doesn't make it true." Tiago held his gaze. Then he leaned down and kissed him. It wasn't gentle, and it wasn't romantic. It was deliberate and heavy, Tiago's hand sliding from Dario's jaw to the scarred nape of his neck, pulling him in with a bruising force. Dario didn't resist. The terrifying iron wire control that defined the royal shadow guard fractured. His hands found Tiago's hips, gripping the heavy velvet of his tunic, pulling him down until Tiago's weight settled entirely against him on the edge of the bed. The urgency stripped away the cold of the room. Tiago's fingers worked blindly at the buttons of Dario's undershirt, his mouth dragging down the line of Dario's throat, pressing against the frantic, hammering pulse beneath the skin. Dario's breathing changed, the measured, rhythmic inhales breaking into something ragged and desperate as Tiago pressed his body against him, chest to chest, the ambient heat of the room spiking until the freezing mountain outside ceased to exist. They moved together with a brutal, consuming friction. Here, behind 3 locked doors, rank and title, and the looming threat of execution dissolved entirely. Tiago was reverent, his hands moving over the jagged, silver scars of Dario's back with the focused, desperate attention of a man trying to memorize the geography of something he was terrified of losing. Dario was less careful. His grip was punishing, his calloused fingers pressing hard enough into Tiago's shoulders to leave marks, dragging him closer with a physical force that contradicted every detached, transactional word he had ever spoken. It was a physical surrender, the most dangerous man on the mountain allowing himself to be pinned to a mattress by a sociopath. Afterward they lay in the dark, the air heavy and damp with sweat. Tiago was pressed against Dario's side, one arm draped heavily across his chest, his face resting in the hollow between Dario's shoulder and neck. He could feel the steady, slowing thud of Dario's heart against his palm. "Stay," Tiago whispered into the dark. Dario didn't answer for a long time. The geothermal vents hummed softly beneath the floorboards. The heavy locks on the door remained engaged. Slowly, Dario shifted his weight, settling deeper into the mattress. He wrapped his arm around Tiago's waist, pulling him flush against his side. He didn't reach for his boots. Tiago closed his eyes. For the first time since the embargo began, the locked room felt less like a hiding place and more like the only safe ground left in the world. He fell asleep with his hand resting perfectly still over Dario's heart. I hope you are enjoying this story so far. Let me know in the comments below if you would like a spin-off or part 2 of this story. Don't forget to like and subscribe and to check out our Patreon page. Chapter 8: The Breaking Point. The first iron lock disengaged at the wrong hour. Tiago's eyes opened. The sealed eastern wing was pitch black. The geothermal vents cast their faint amber light across the vaulted ceiling in slow, pulsing waves. Dario's chest rose and fell against his arm, steady, still deep in sleep. The second lock disengaged. Tiago sat up. The air in the room suddenly felt entirely devoid of oxygen. There was no scheduled entry, no shift rotation until dawn. He reached for Dario's bare shoulder. The third lock broke inward. The door didn't just open, it was kicked off its hinges. The heavy timber slammed against the velvet-lined wall with a concussive bang that shook the porcelain basin off the bedside table. 3 figures rushed through the doorway, dressed in unmarked, light-absorbing black leather, their faces covered, short blades drawn. Dario was on his feet before Tiago fully registered the noise. The royal shadow moved the way he always moved, precise, economical, no wasted motion. He grabbed the heavy oak chair beside the bed and drove it square into the first attacker's chest, knocking the man backward into the second. His hand found the short blade sheathed in his uniform jacket hanging on the chair back, and he pulled it free in a single, fluid motion. The first attacker recovered, lunging forward. Dario sidestepped, caught the man's wrist, and buried his blade upward, directly under the attacker's jaw. The body dropped like a stone. Dario pivoted smoothly, putting himself entirely between Tiago and the remaining 2. "Get behind the bed," Dario ordered. His voice was flat, combat steady. The second attacker came in fast, feinting left and driving a short blade toward Dario's ribs. Dario blocked the strike with his forearm. The enemy blade sliced clean through the skin of his already scarred left arm, but Dario didn't flinch. He countered, driving a vicious elbow into the man's temple. The attacker staggered. Dario closed the distance and put him down with a brutal thrust through the throat. The third was already moving. He was faster than the others, his stance wider. He didn't lunge, he circled, keeping his blade low, waiting for Dario to commit. Dario was bleeding heavily from the forearm cut. His feet were bare on the freezing stone floor. He was wearing nothing but his black undershirt and uniform trousers. The attacker struck. Dario parried, but the angle was slightly off. The enemy blade slid past his guard and drove deep into his left side, just beneath the ribs. Dario made no sound. He didn't drop his weapon. He grabbed the attacker's wrist with both hands, physically trapping the blade inside his own body, and head-butted the man hard enough to shatter his nose. The attacker stumbled backward, screaming, losing his grip on the weapon hilt. Dario pulled the blade out of his own side, reversed it, and threw it. The iron hit the attacker dead in the sternum. He fell. The room went absolutely quiet. Dario stood for 2 seconds, swaying slightly, his chest heaving. Then his legs gave out. He dropped to his knees on the stone floor, his left hand pressing against the wound in his side. Blood ran between his fingers in thick, steady pulses, pooling black on the basalt. Tiago scrambled off the bed and caught him before his face hit the floor. He lowered Dario onto his back, pressing both of his own hands over the wound, his palms instantly slick and hot. Dario's face was chalk-white. His breathing had gone shallow and unnaturally fast. "Stay with me," Tiago said. His voice had lost every layer of warmth, performance, and aristocratic charm he had ever constructed. It was raw. It was the voice of a man watching the only thing he loved drain out between his fingers. "Dario, look at me. Stay with me." Dario's eyes found his. He opened his mouth to speak, but what came out was a wet, rattling sound. The blade had gone much deeper than it looked. "Don't talk," Tiago said, pressing harder on the wound, his shoulders shaking. "Don't talk, I'm calling for the surgeon. You're going to be fine." Dario's hand found Tiago's wrist. His grip was incredibly weak, nothing like the bruising force that had left marks on Tiago's shoulders hours ago. He held on, his bloodied fingers curling loosely around the exact same wrist where his pulse had beaten steady under Tiago's thumb in another life. Tiago screamed for the guards. Beatriz heard the commotion from the sealed wing. She set down her quill and stood from her desk. The heavy obsidian door of her study opened. It was not her guard. 2 figures in unmarked black leather stepped into the room. They moved in perfect tandem, flanking the doorway, blocking the exit with practiced efficiency. Beatriz looked at the drawn blades in their hands, then at the empty corridor behind them where her enforcer should have been standing. She didn't scream. She didn't reach for a hidden weapon. She stood behind her mahogany desk, her gloved hands resting flat on the polished surface, and drew one slow, measured breath. She had spent her entire life calculating outcomes. She could see this one clearly enough. The ledgers on her desk, the diplomatic seals, the territorial maps, the High Court intelligence reports, were still arranged in the precise, perfect order she had placed them that morning. The resonant slate displaying the lower city supply routes still glowed faintly beside her inkwell. Beatrice looked at the closest attacker. "Tell whoever bought you that the diplomatic pillar dies with me," she said, her voice completely steady. "Everything I built, every alliance, every court ruling, it is locked in my head, not on these documents. You're buying a corpse and a stack of useless paper." The attacker didn't answer. He stepped forward. Beatrice closed her eyes. Ines was in the servant corridors when the alarm bell started. The sound was deafening. 3 massive iron bells mounted in the upper towers, ringing in an irregular, panicked rhythm she had never heard before. She ran. She didn't think about where to go. Her feet carried her instinctively toward Beatrice's study, sprinting through the narrow ventilation passages she had mapped during her weeks of confinement. She took the steep stone stairs 3 at a time, her shoulders scraping the basalt, her lungs burning in the thin air. She reached the main study corridor and stopped. The enforcer was dead on the floor outside the door, his throat cut. The obsidian doors were wide open, one of them hanging at a crooked angle from a damaged iron hinge. Ines stepped inside. Beatrice was on the floor behind her desk. She was lying on her side, her gloved hands still curled loosely, her eyes closed. There was very little blood. The blade had been precise, a single fatal wound just below the collarbone angled downward. The room was freezing. The resonant slate on the desk was still glowing, its amber light casting a thin, steady haze over the scattered parchment ledgers. The diplomatic seals were untouched. The attackers hadn't taken a single piece of paper. Ines stood in the doorway for a long time. She remembered Beatrice adjusting the strap of a maize sack on her shoulder. She remembered Beatrice standing in the freezing rain of the lower docks, pointing at the starving militia boys and demanding Ines look at the cost of war. She remembered Beatrice looking at her, not with warmth, never with warmth, but with the cold, honest acknowledgement that the bastard sister was capable, necessary, and worth keeping alive. It wasn't love. They were never going to be sisters, but Beatrice was the only person in the entire caldera who had treated Ines like a player instead of a pawn, and she was gone. Ines knelt beside her. She reached out and closed the leather portfolio that was still open on the desk, pressing the cover flat. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. Then she stood up and walked out of the study. The corridor was filling with running guards, shouting servants, and the sustained, panicked ringing of the alarm bells. A breathless enforcer intercepted her at the stairwell, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "Lady Ines, Lord Tiago was attacked in the eastern wing," the guard gasped. "His bodyguard is critically wounded. Lord Tiago is alive, but the wing is locked down." Ines looked at the enforcer, and Valdir. Lord Valdir's outpost reported no disturbance. His heavy infantry is holding position in the outer range. No disturbance. Of course not. He was the one who probably ordered the coordinated strike in the first place. "Seal the lower city gates," Ines ordered. The words came out steady, carrying a cold authority she hadn't planned and didn't question. "Send word to the canal authorities. Full lockdown on all supply routes until we confirm the assassins didn't retreat through our network. And get me a roster of every guard who was reassigned from the study corridor tonight. I want to know exactly who moved Beatrice's protection." The enforcer hesitated. He looked at her, the feral bastard sister in a soot-stained tunic, giving military orders in a corridor full of highborn guards. Then he looked past her at the open door of the study, where the eldest legitimate heir of House Monteiro lay dead on the marble floor. He saluted and ran. Ines walked down the stairwell toward the lower fortress, the alarm bells still hammering above her. She had come to this mountain to find a way to protect her mother. She had stayed to survive. Now, the only person who had shielded her was dead, and the only forces she could trust were the dockworkers, foundry laborers, and canal smugglers who followed a bastard girl with no legal standing. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was in the war. Chapter 9: The Slum Army. Ines found Nico in the lower barracks before the upper fortress alarm bells had stopped ringing. He was standing in the central yard with 11 of his squad members, all of them armed. None of them wore Tiago's militia insignia. They had torn the heavy provincial patches off their leather breastplates sometime in the last hour. The discarded fabric lay in a soaked, muddy pile on the wet cobblestones. "I need you to leave the city," Ines said. Nico stared at her, gripping the haft of his spear. "Right now, the upper fortress is. Right now, take your squad. Take the eastern canal route to the coast road. Get to Ribera before dawn." She pulled a folded piece of heavy parchment from her tunic and pressed it into his cold hand. "My mother's name is Solange. She lives in a basalt cottage at the top of the terrace road next to old Mateo's well. You bring her to the fishing village at Ponta Gorda and you keep her there until I send word." Ines stepped closer, lowering her voice. "If anyone wearing a Monteiro crest or a crown sash comes within a mile of that village, you put her on a boat and send her to the Leeward Islands." Nico looked at the parchment, then at her face. "You're sending your best squad away from the fight." "I'm sending the only people I trust to do the one thing that matters," Ines said flatly. "Everything else on this mountain I can figure out. This, I can't lose." Nico folded the parchment and shoved it behind his breastplate. He didn't argue. He gave a sharp, two-finger whistle to his squad, and they moved out toward the eastern gate at a fast, disciplined walk, their weapons clinking in the pre-dawn dark. Ines watched them vanish into the fog. Then she turned her back on the sea and faced the lower city. By sunrise, Minister Silva had moved. Crown enforcers appeared at every major intersection of the upper fortress within 2 hours of Beatrice's death. They wore the crimson sash of the royal authority and carried heavy iron locks. Silva didn't make speeches. He didn't execute loyalists. He simply occupied the administrative choke points. Ines watched from the mid-level funicular landing as 2 crown guards chained the heavy doors of the central granary, hammering a royal seal over the lock. The decree was posted in crisp, black ink. "By order of the Crown, all House Monteiro military and diplomatic operations are suspended pending a formal succession inquiry." The one move that drew blood was surgical. Commander Dario had been found gravely wounded in the private quarters of Lord Tiago Monteiro. Within the hour, Crown medical personnel, flanked by 6 heavy infantry enforcers, loaded Dario onto a covered stretcher and transferred him to an undisclosed Crown medical facility. The official Resonance Dispatch cited the need to secure and interrogate all persons connected to the assassination. The real message was much simpler. Silva now held the one bleeding, fragile thing Tiago Monteiro would burn the world to recover. In the lower city, however, the Crown's reach was thinner. Silva's enforcers held the funicular station and the main harbor gate, but they didn't have the numbers to patrol the sprawling, labyrinthine docks, the foundry district, or the residential warrens. She set up in the back of the dried fish stall on Dock Row, the same stall where she had hidden from the dragon. It became a command post by default, simply because every canal worker, dockhand, and foundry laborer who needed instructions already knew where to find her. "The Racha Guild is panicking," a smuggler reported, leaning over the wooden counter that smelled of salt and dried cod. "They think the Crown is going to seize the eastern sea caves." "Tell them the embargo is dead," Ines said, sketching a route on the back of a wax paper fish wrapper with a charcoal stick. "I'm cutting the smugglers' premium in half, but I'm guaranteeing triple the volume. If they don't accept, I'll let the Crown seize their caves." The smuggler nodded and ran. She dispatched 2 of Beatrice's former servants, women who had worked the upper kitchen stores, to physically inventory the lower city caches. She needed hard numbers on how long the docks could hold out if Silva sealed the harbor gate permanently. By mid-afternoon, the fishermen had dragged a second wooden table out beside the stall. A line of dockworkers, canal operators, and market vendors stretched down the block, standing in the freezing rain. waiting to report supply levels, request grain allocations, or volunteer for infrastructure repair. It was the exact same work Ines had done in Ribeira for old Matteo, scaled up to a city of 12,000 people. Late in the afternoon, a foundry foreman named Gaspar, a broad-chested man with 20 years of soot permanently tattooed into the creases of his knuckles, set a cargo manifest down on the fish counter. "The Crown posted a decree at the harbor gate," Gaspar grunted. "Says all unauthorized food distribution is suspended. Says anyone operating outside Crown authority is subject to arrest." "I saw it," Ines said, marking a charcoal tally on the canal map. "There are 400 dockworkers on this row who ate today because of your grain," Gaspar said, leaning his heavy forearms on the counter. "There are 600 foundry workers in my district who went back to the furnaces because you guaranteed rations. None of them are going to stop contributing because a man in a silk robe nailed a piece of paper to a gate." Ines stopped writing. She looked up. Gaspar wasn't asking for instructions. He was telling her the line had been drawn. "We need the canal locks reinforced," Ines said quietly. "The pressure gates at the third junction are the weakest structural point. If Valdir tries to march his heavy infantry through the lower city, or if the Crown pushes from the harbor, the canals are our only geographic choke point. Can your foundry crews reinforce the lock mechanisms?" "Give me 2 days and 60 pounds of raw iron stock," Gaspar said, tapping a thick finger against the wooden counter. "I'll make those pressure gates hold against a siege ram." "You'll have the iron by morning," Ines said. Gaspar picked up his manifest and walked away. The line shuffled forward. The next person stepped up, dropping a wet tally sheet onto the table. Ines picked up her charcoal and kept working. The sun set over the harbor, but the lower city didn't sleep. Canal boats, stripped of their lanterns, carried grain through the dark waterways. Heavy forge hammers rang out in the Rocha district as workers beat raw iron into reinforced lock bolts. Market vendors distributed rations from the Canal Authority stockpiles, while Crown enforcers watched from the harbor gate, gripping their spears, unwilling to cross the threshold into the docks. Ines rolled up the wax paper canal map and tucked it inside her tunic. She looked out at the lower city, the working foundries, the silent supply boats threading through the dark water, the organized, mechanical defiance of thousands of people. She wasn't just running a supply line anymore. She had the survival of thousands of people resting on her shoulders. Chapter 10: The Proxy Collapse. The Crown's ultimatum arrived on a sealed resonance slate, delivered to Tiago's quarters by 2 armed enforcers. They stood in the doorway, hands resting on their sword hilts, watching him read it. The message from Minister Silva was 3 sentences long. "Commander Dario has been found guilty of treason under the Crown's intelligence charter for unauthorized disclosure of classified materials. Execution is scheduled for the end of the week. This sentence will be commuted if Lord Tiago cooperates fully with the Crown's emergency succession authority, publicly recognizing Crown governance and formally dissolving all territorial militia contracts." Tiago read the glowing amber script twice. He set the slate face down on his desk. Silva wasn't negotiating. He was collecting. The alliance, the intelligence pipeline, the territorial claims, all of it had been a mechanism to get Tiago invested enough that the Crown could use Dario as a lever. The moment Dario was down, Tiago's usefulness as an ally ended. Tiago told the enforcers he needed an hour to consider the terms. They stepped back, locking the heavy oak door from the outside. Tiago stood in the empty room. He stared at the dark stain on the floorboards where Dario had bled. He had spent his entire life playing people, watching provincial lords and guild masters telegraph their intentions, believing he was the only one holding the strings. Now, the silk was wrapped so tightly around his own throat he couldn't breathe. He didn't wait the hour. He walked to the hidden servant corridor, forced open the grate, and began the long descent into the lower strata. Ines was at the fish stall on Dock Row when Tiago appeared at the end of the block. She saw him before he reached her, a tall figure in an immaculately tailored velvet coat, walking through the freezing lower city docks. He had no guards, he had no escort, and he didn't have the warm, terrifying smile that had been his armor since the day she met him. He looked entirely hollowed out. The crowd of dockworkers parted around him not out of fear, but because they didn't understand what a highborn heir was doing in their mud without a weapon. He stopped in front of the stall. "You look terrible," Ines said, leaning her forearms against the wood. "Silva has Dario," Tiago said. "No preamble, no charm. He's going to execute him at the end of the week unless I publicly dissolve my militia and hand the crown full succession authority." "And you're here because you're not going to do that," Ines said. "I'm here because doing it won't save him," Tiago said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Silva will kill Dario regardless. Once I've testified, I am useless to the crown, and Dario is the only loose end connecting Silva to the intelligence leaks. Silva does not leave loose ends." Ines studied him. The man standing in front of her was the same person who had built a meat-shield militia out of starving children. He was a sociopath who had eaten roasted quail while his soldiers gnawed stale bread. She felt absolutely no sympathy. What she felt was the cold, heavy weight of a calculation snapping into place. "What can you do for me?" Ines asked. Tiago reached inside his coat and pulled out a small, black leather folio. He set it on the fish counter between the waxed paper bundles. He didn't hand it to her. He opened it, revealing a single resonant slate covered in heavily encrypted routing codes. Encoded dispatches between Silva and an unidentified agent in the outer volcanic range, dated 2 days before Beatriz was killed, Tiago said. "I can't decode the cipher, but the routing signature matches the mining outpost where Valdir and I met." Ines stared at the glowing slate. Silva and Valdir coordinated the assassination together. "Yes," Tiago said. "Silva removed Beatriz to collapse the diplomatic pillar for the crown. Valdir removed the political obstacle to his military consolidation. They used each other." "And you were the blind spot in the middle," Ines said. Tiago's jaw tightened. "Yes." Ines looked at the folio, then up at her brother. "What do you want?" "Dario," Tiago said. "Alive, out of crown custody, that is all." "That is not all," Ines said, her voice dropping into a flat, absolute register. "If I pull Dario out of a crown detention facility, Silva will declare open war on the lower city. I need more than documents. I need you to publicly sign a formal recognition of the canal authority. I need you to permanently dissolve every militia contract in your name. And I need you to testify to the provincial lords that Silva engineered this crisis." Tiago stared at her. "You want me to completely destroy myself?" "I want you to be useful," Ines said. "You told me once that pieces don't make demands. You were right. So stop making demands, Tiago, and start being a piece I can use." Tiago looked at her for a long moment. The docks moved around them, workers hauling heavy sacks of grain, canal boats scraping against the stone wharves, the ringing of foundry hammers echoing through the rain. The bastard sister he had dismissed as an uneducated variable was sitting behind a rotting wooden counter running an entire city, and she was offering him the only deal that would keep Dario breathing. "Get him out," Tiago said, his voice dead, "and I will give you everything." The dragon launched from the outer volcanic range at dusk. It was a brutal, agonizing ascent. The beast's right wing beat at full, terrifying extension, but the left, where the fortress resonance bolt had torn a 6-foot hole through the membrane, hitched violently on every downstroke. The partially healed tissue stretched and split at the edges, spraying dark blood into the wind. The beast flew in a lurching, asymmetric pattern, losing altitude on every tight turn. Valdir didn't care. He sat in the heavy iron saddle, driving his spurs into the beast's armored neck, forcing it higher. He had received the scouting report. Tiago had gone to the lower city without an escort. The alliance was dead. Silva's enforcers were locking down the upper fortress, and the bastard sister's canal authority was fortifying the docks while Valdir sat grounded in a mining outpost. He was done waiting. Below the struggling dragon, 300 heavy infantry marched down the mountain road in tight, disciplined formation. They carried iron siege ladders, heavy battering rams, and enough resonance charges to permanently breach the harbor gate. Valdir's orders were absolute. Take the lower city, shatter the canal locks, and kill anyone who stood near the water. In the lower city, Gaspar's foundry crews heard the infantry drums first. The sound carried down the mountain in the freezing evening air, a low, rhythmic thudding that bounced off the basalt cliffs and rolled through the dock district like a physical weight. Workers stopped hammering. Canal operators looked up from their ropes. The old fisherman stepped out of her stall, clutching her scaling knife. Ines was already moving. A breathless canal runner had reached her stall 10 minutes earlier, dragon airborne, infantry mobilized, heading for the main gate. She pulled the wax paper canal map from her tunic, slapped it flat on the fish counter, and started issuing orders to the gathered foremen. "Pull everyone back from the harbor gate," she commanded, her finger tracing a line down the map. "Let them breach it. Evacuate Dock Row entirely. Gaspar, the canal locks." "Reinforced and ready," the massive foundry worker grunted. "The pressure gates at the third junction are locked tight. We can flood the entire basin on your signal." "Don't flood them yet," Ines said, her eyes locked on the map. "If we flood it too early, Valdir's infantry will retreat back up the mountain and we lose them. I need them deep inside the basin." She dispatched runners to every canal checkpoint with the exact same instruction: fall back, give ground. Let the heavy infantry advance through the shattered harbor gate, march down the main thoroughfare, and walk directly into the deep, walled canal basin at the third junction. It was the exact same junction where she had hidden in the wall while Nico misdirected the patrol. The choke point where 3 deepwater channels met, and the sheer basalt walls were close enough to touch on both sides. A place with no high ground and no exits. The infantry drums grew deafening. The shadow of the wounded dragon passed over the harbor, its uneven, lurching wingbeats casting a strobing darkness across the empty docks. Ines rolled up the canal map. She looked at Gaspar. She looked at the long, dark waterway stretching into the heart of the lower city, where heavy, reinforced iron gates waited silently in the water. "Let them in," she said. Chapter 11: The New Canopy. Valdir's heavy infantry entered the canal basin in a tight column formation. Their steel boots struck the wet basalt in unison, the sound echoing off the narrow walls like a war drum played inside a stone coffin. They moved fast. The shattered harbor gate had been entirely undefended. Ines had pulled every canal worker and dockhand back behind the third junction, leaving the main thoroughfare open and dead quiet. Valdir's infantry commander read the silence as a rout. He pushed his 300 men deeper into the lower city, marching through the widening avenue that funneled directly into the deep basin. Above them the dragons circled in a lurching, asymmetric pattern, the damaged left wing hitching violently on every downstroke. Valdir sat in the saddle, scanning the dark streets for defensive barricades or ambush points. He saw nothing. The docks were empty. The foundries were dark. The fish stalls were boarded shut. The infantry reached the basin. Ines stood in the dark on the maintenance platform 30 feet above the third junction. She could see the entire basin. She looked across the gap at Gaspar. The massive foundry foreman was standing in the shadows beside the primary lock mechanism, both hands gripping a heavy iron release lever. He was watching her. Ines dropped her hand. Gaspar threw the lever. The reinforced iron lock gates at all 3 channel entrances slammed shut simultaneously. The drop bolts drove home into the bedrock with a concussive, deafening bang that shook the stone walls. At the far end of the basin, a second foundry crew threw their lever, sealing the harbor exit. The infantry was boxed in. Then the water came. The pressure gates above the third junction released, venting the full, backed-up volume of the upper canal reservoir directly into the sealed basin. The water didn't trickle. It surged. A roaring, white-capped wall of freezing ocean water poured through the overflow channels, hitting the basin floor with the force of a landslide. The ankle-deep pools became knee-deep in 3 seconds, then waist-deep. Soldiers in 80 pounds of heavy steel armor stumbled and went under, dragged down by the weight of their own equipment. The disciplined formation dissolved into blind, screaming panic. Men scrambled for the embankment walls, their metal gauntlets clawing uselessly at the smooth, sheer basalt, their swords dropped in the churning water. Along the top of the basin walls, dockworkers and canal crews stepped out from the maintenance corridors. They didn't carry weapons. They carried heavy cargo chains, boat hooks, and iron lock bars. They systematically sealed every upper drainage grate and overflow vent. The basin became a sealed tank. Valdir saw the trap springing from above. He pulled the dragon into a steep, reckless dive toward the basin, the beast's jaws unhinging, the orange heat shimmer building in the back of its throat. If he could melt the iron lock gates, the water would drain and his infantry could survive. The dragon dropped below the roofline of the surrounding warehouses. Beatrice's resonance cannons fired. 3 bolts of blue-white mana hit the beast in rapid succession, 2 detonating against its armored chest, the third striking the exact base of the damaged wing. The dragon shrieked, the sound splitting the air, and its right wing seized. The partially healed membrane tore from edge to joint, the tissue shredding like wet sailcloth. The wing collapsed, the dragon fell. It hit the basin at a steep angle, 60 tons of armored scale slamming into the flooded stone with a concussive impact that sent a 10-foot wave of water crashing over the embankment walls. Drowning soldiers were crushed instantly. The beast thrashed, its remaining wing beating the water into a blinding froth, its claws tearing massive gouges in the basalt as it tried to right itself. But the basin was too narrow, the water was too deep, and the shattered wing wouldn't hold its weight. Valdir was thrown from the saddle on impact. He hit the water hard. His steel armor, the same polished, immaculate plate he had worn when he bonded the dragon in the Grand Hall, immediately pulled him under. He surfaced once, his gauntleted hand reaching desperately for the dragon's thrashing neck. The dying beast rolled. 60 tons of muscle and panic crushed the water exactly where its rider had just been. The basin slowly went still. The dragon lay on its side in the flooded junction, its chest heaving in shallow, bubbling breaths, its head submerged, its one good wing pinned beneath its own weight. It let out a low, rumbling moan that vibrated through the bedrock and faded into the sound of water lapping against the stone walls. Valdir did not surface again. The Crown Detention Facility was a converted administrative building in the upper fortress, guarded by 6 enforcers and sealed with heavy resonance locks. While every Crown enforcer in the city was scrambling to the walls to watch the disaster unfolding in the canal basin, the brass grate of a forgotten laundry chute popped open. 3 of Ines's canal runners stepped out. They carried lockpicks fashioned from foundry scraps and a master resonance key Tiago had surrendered. They found Dario in a windowless room on the 3rd floor. He was lying on a narrow cot, his wound rebandaged but poorly treated, his skin the color of old ash from blood loss. He was conscious. He didn't ask questions when the smugglers told him to move. He walked out of the building under his own power, leaning heavily on a canal runner's shoulder, and vanished down the servant corridors before the Crown enforcers ever checked the door. The provincial lords assembled in the Grand Caldera Hall 3 days after the battle. The hall was freezing. The shattered stained glass from Valdir's first tantrum had barely been replaced, and the mountain wind blew freely through the empty archways. 12 lords sat in their chairs, wrapped in heavy furs, their faces drawn with the particular, hollow exhaustion of men who had watched 2 Monteiro heirs die in the span of a month. Minister Silva stood at the back of the chamber, flanked by his remaining Crown enforcers. His crimson sash was immaculate. His expression was calm. Ines entered through the main obsidian doors. She was wearing the exact same soot-stained canvas tunic she had worn the day she was dragged into the fortress. She walked straight to the center of the chamber, set a black leather folio on the executor's podium, and opened it. 3 weeks ago, Minister Silva issued emergency decrees suspending House Monteiro governance and placing this fortress under Crown authority, Ines said. Her voice carried easily over the wind. Before I distribute these documents, I want Lord Tiago Monteiro to address the council. Tiago stepped out from the shadows of the side chamber. He looked gaunt, the elegant velvet coat gone, replaced by a plain, rough wool tunic. He stood before the lords. For the first time in his life, he did not smile. He spoke for 10 minutes. He pulled documents from the folio and slapped them onto the podium one by one. He presented the ledgers proving the Crown had jointly funded his militia enlistment to destabilize the house. He laid out the banknotes proving the Crown had paid the Racha Guild to maintain the embargo and starve the lower city. He read aloud the encoded routing signatures between Silva's office and Valdir's outpost, sent exactly 2 days before Beatriz was assassinated. Finally, Tiago signed a piece of parchment formally dissolving every militia contract in his name. He signed a second parchment legally recognizing the Canal Authority as the sovereign administrative body of the lower city. He did not apologize to the lords. He did not ask for forgiveness. He stated the facts, signed his name, and stepped back into the shadows. Silva watched the entire testimony without interrupting. When Tiago finished, Silva looked at the provincial lords and then at Ines. The Crown's actions were taken strictly in the interest of stability during a violent succession crisis, Silva said, his voice a smooth, measured baritone. The documents presented here have been selectively forged by a disgraced heir attempting to avoid execution for treason. The Crown maintains its legal authority over this territory. Ines rested her raw, calloused hands on the edges of the podium. The Crown is welcome to maintain whatever it wants, she said. But the lower city feeds this mountain. The Canal Authority currently controls the supply routes, the dock infrastructure, and the labor force that keeps 12,000 people alive. If the Crown wants to administer an empty fortress on top of a starving rock, you are welcome to stay. If you want the food to keep coming, you work through me. Silva held her gaze. He was an opportunist. He knew when to push and when to give. The evidence of his assassination plot was public. The lords had heard the confession, and most importantly, the lower city was armed, organized, and controlling the only thing that mattered. Forcing a military occupation now would cost the Crown far more than a tactical retreat. Silva inclined his head, a minimal, microscopic tilt of his chin that conceded nothing formally, but yielded everything practically. He turned on his heel and walked out of the chamber, his enforcers falling into step behind him. The Crown would be back. Silva would regroup, find new leverage, and play the long game the way he always had. But today, the shadow retreated. In the Racha district safe house, Tiago sat on a splintered wooden chair beside a narrow bed. Dario was awake. His color was still bad, and the deep puncture in his side was tightly bound in clean linen, but his eyes were sharp. He had been watching Tiago for several minutes in the dim light. "You gave up your territorial claims," Dario said, his voice a dry rasp. "Your militia, your Crown intelligence pipeline, your seat in the succession." "Yes," Tiago said. "For me." "Yes." Dario looked up at the ceiling. The safe house was small and freezing. Outside, the sounds of the lower city filtered through the thin walls. "This is exactly what makes you too soft to be a successor," Dario said quietly. "You had everything, and you traded it for a wounded soldier in a damp basement." Tiago leaned forward in the chair, resting his elbows on his knees. "I traded it for the only thing in that fortress I actually wanted to keep." Dario turned his head. Something shifted behind his eyes, the flat, terrifying control of the royal commander slipping away, leaving something older and vastly less defended. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and rested his palm on Tiago's forearm. His fingers curled loosely around Tiago's wrist. He didn't let go. Tiago covered Dario's hand with his own. He sat there in the flickering lamplight, listening to the city operating outside, holding on to the one who mattered the most to him. Nico arrived from Ribeira 4 days after the battle. He walked into the dried fish stall on Dock Row with volcanic dust caked on his boots and a folded piece of parchment in his hand. He set it on the wooden counter in front of Ines. "Your mother is in Ponta Gorda," Nico said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "She's safe. Old Matteo went with her. She told me to give you this." Ines unfolded the heavy parchment. It was a single line of her mother's handwriting, the ink slightly smudged, the letters cramped and shaky from the coastal cold. Come home when you can. I will wait. Ines folded the parchment carefully and slid it deep inside her tunic, resting it flat against her chest. She didn't read it again. She didn't need to. The canal guard needs a commander, Ines said, looking up at Nico. Someone the dockworkers trust. Someone who knows the lower city and won't take bribes from the guild masters. The pay is pretty damn good too. Nico stared at her. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a purpose, Ines said, tossing a charcoal stick onto the map. You spent 6 weeks holding a rusted spear for a man who fed you stale bread. I'm asking you to hold a canal lock for a city you care about. When do I start? He asked. The sun finally reached the lower docks 2 hours after the fishermen had already launched their skiff into the gray Atlantic surf. Ines stood at the edge of the rebuilt canal bridge at the third junction, watching the early light hit the water. The basin below had been completely drained, cleared, and repaired. The dragon's massive corpse had been hauled out to the sea by a team of 40 dockworkers using cargo chains and heavy industrial pulleys. The lock gates were fully operational. The morning supply boats were already gliding through the dark water. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't wearing a fisherman's cap pulled low over her eyes or binding her hair with linen twine to look like Enzo. She was standing in the open, in the center of the city she had fed and armed and defended. The people walking past her on the embankment nodded, or raised a hand, or simply kept moving. Beatrice's high-backed chair in the grand hall was currently empty. Ines hadn't taken it. She didn't need a marble chair to run a city. The dragon was dead. The terror it represented was broken. The crown was still out there, circling the island, eternally patient. But the mountain had a new canopy now, built from iron-locked gates, grain ledgers, and the calloused hands of the people who had decided, in the middle of starvation and fire, that a bastard girl from the terraces was worth following. Ines pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the crinkled parchment of her mother's letter through her tunic. She held it there for a moment against the freezing morning wind. Then she turned her back on the water and walked down into the lower city, where the day's first supply tallies were already waiting on the counter. Quote of the week: anytime you beg another man to set you free, you will never be free. Malcolm X. Thank you for listening to Dragonfall. Hope you enjoyed this story. If you want to hear more, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, and check us out on Patreon. New stories are uploaded every Monday.